The letter arrived on a Tuesday, and by Friday, Walter Whitmore had already stopped writing back. Margaret Holloway stood at the crossroads outside Laramie with her 5-year-old daughter clutching her skirt, reading his final note for the third time while the sky turned the color of a bruise. The words didn't change no matter how many times she read them. Something has come up. Do not come. Do not write again. No apology. No explanation. Just 8 words that erased 6 months of promises, 2 train tickets, and every last dollar she had saved from mending other people's clothes in a Philadelphia row house that smelled like coal smoke and disappointment. She looked down at Rosie. Rosie looked up at her. The first drop of rain hit the paper and bled the ink. If you've ever stood somewhere and realized the ground under you wasn't solid, that you'd been walking on faith the whole time and faith had just given out, then you already know what Margaret felt in that moment. If you've ever had to look into the eyes of a child who trusted you completely and wondered how you were going to explain that the world had failed you both, then you don't need me to describe it. Subscribe to this channel and follow this story to the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels, because what happens next to Margaret and that little girl in the storm is something you will not want to miss. The wagon driver's name was Abe Cutter, and he had hauled passengers across the Wyoming Territory for 11 years without once leaving anyone stranded. He would tell people that later, in the warmth of a saloon, his third whiskey in hand, his voice carrying the particular ease of a man who had already decided not to feel too bad about something. But on that Friday afternoon in October of 1889, Abe Cutter looked at the sky, looked at the road ahead, looked at the woman and the small child standing at the crossroads post, and made a calculation. The calculation did not include them. I can't hold the horses in this, he said, already gathering the reins. Storm's moving fast. If I wait, I lose the road. Margaret had been watching the clouds for 20 minutes. She understood weather the way any sensible person did, as something that happened to you whether you were ready or not. What she didn't understand, what she couldn't quite process through the cold that was already seeping through her coat, was that the man she'd paid $14 to deliver her safely was now looking past her like she was a fence post. You said Whitmore's ranch was another 4 miles, she said. You said you knew the road. I know the road in clear weather. Abe's jaw was set. He wasn't a cruel man, she could see that. He was just a man who had already made his decision and was waiting for her to accept it. There's a way station back 8 miles. I can take you there. 8 miles back. She said it flat. Not a question. Yes, ma'am. That's 8 miles away from where I'm supposed to be. Yes, ma'am, I understand that. Rosie had pressed herself against Margaret's side without making a sound. That was the thing about Rosie that people noticed and then forgot. She was a quiet child, not because she was timid, but because she'd learned very early that the world did not slow down to wait for small people to catch up. She watched things. She listened. She stored information the way some children stored rocks or buttons, carefully, in places only she knew about. She was watching Abe Cutter now. Mama, she said quietly. I know, Margaret said. She looked at the crossroads post. She looked at the letter in her hand, already going soft in the rain. She thought about Walter Whitmore's handwriting, which was careful and even. The handwriting of a man who wanted to appear more considered than he was. She had admired that handwriting for 6 months. She had read his letters to Rosie at bedtime, leaving out the parts that felt too private, keeping the parts that felt like proof. A good man, she'd told herself, a steady man, a man who means what he writes. 8 words. Take us back, she said. Abe nodded, visibly relieved, and reached a hand down to help her up. She didn't take it. Let me get my trunk, she said. He blinked. Ma'am, there's no room on my trunk, she said again. Her voice had not changed volume. It had changed something else. Or I ride back with it, and you explain to me where you plan to put it, or I don't ride at all, and you explain that to yourself for the rest of your life. Your choice, Mr. Cutter. Abe Cutter spent a long moment studying the middle distance. Then he climbed down and helped her load the trunk. They had been moving for 40 minutes when the storm stopped being weather and started being something else entirely. The wind shifted direction twice in the span of 10 minutes, which meant it wasn't traveling, it was building. The horses felt it before the people did. They began pulling sideways, ears flat, necks bent at angles that said very clearly they did not want to be where they were. Abe pulled them to a stop at a shallow creek crossing. The creek was not shallow anymore. "I'm not crossing that," he said. Margaret looked at the water. It was brown and moving fast, carrying sticks and dead grass and things she couldn't identify. The road on the other side disappeared into a wall of rain so thick it looked like a curtain someone had hung there. "The way station is on the other side," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "And the crossroads is behind us." "Yes, ma'am." She stared at him. He had the decency to look at something other than her face. "I can leave you the canvas tarp," he said. "There's a stand of cottonwoods just up the bank. It's not ideal, but you're leaving us." "I have a wife," he said. "I have 3 children. I can't—" He stopped, swallowed. "I'm sorry. I truly am. I would not do this if I had another choice." Margaret thought about telling him that everyone always had another choice, and that what they were really saying when they claimed otherwise was that the other choice cost them something they didn't want to pay. She thought about telling him what it felt like to stand in the rain with a 5-year-old and no money and nowhere to go while a man explained his very important reasons for leaving. She didn't say any of it. She lifted Rosie down from the wagon and took the canvas tarp from Abe Cutter's outstretched hands. "Keep the trunk," she said. He blinked. "Ma'am?" "The trunk. Keep it. Sell what's in it, leave it in the road, I don't care. I'm not dragging it through that." She looked at the cottonwoods. They were maybe 30 yards off the road, clustered thick enough to break some of the wind. "Rosie, come with me." She heard the wagon moving behind her before she'd taken 20 steps. She didn't turn around. The cottonwoods were better than nothing, which was the most optimistic thing that could be said about them. Margaret got the tarp rigged between 2 trunks using the rope Abe had left wrapped around it. She wasn't sure if that was guilt or planning, didn't matter, and pulled Rosie in close underneath it. The rain came in sideways regardless. The ground was already mud. Rosie's shoes were soaked through inside of 3 minutes. "I'm cold," Rosie said. "I know. Is Mr. Whitmore coming?" Margaret opened her mouth, closed it. "No," she said. "He's not." Rosie considered this with the grave, unsurprised expression of a child who has been let down before and has developed a system for processing it. "Is he a bad man?" "I don't know yet. Maybe he's just a small one." "What's the difference?" Margaret pulled her daughter tighter. "Bad men do things on purpose. Small men just don't do anything at all." Rosie nodded like this made sense and tucked her face against her mother's coat. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees inside of an hour. Margaret could feel it in her hands first, that specific cold that wasn't uncomfortable anymore, but had crossed into something that needed attention, the kind that made your fingers slow and your thinking go muddy at the edges. She kept moving her toes inside her boots. She kept counting her breaths. She went through everything she had in her coat pockets: 2 hairpins, a handkerchief, 37 cents, and Walter's letter, which she took out and looked at one more time and then tucked back without reading. She thought about her sister's house in Philadelphia, the coal smell, the narrow bed she and Rosie had shared in the back room, listening to her sister's husband cough through the walls at night, the job at the dress shop that paid enough to eat and not enough to stay. She thought about the afternoon she'd found Walter Whitmore's advertisement in the back of the paper, between a notice about a lost dog and an announcement for a church social, and how something in her had gone very still and very quiet when she'd read it. The way things go quiet right before you make a decision you can't take back. Rancher, 38, Wyoming Territory. Honest work and honest living, seeking companionship and partnership. Children welcome. Children welcome. She had read those 2 words 11 times before she clipped the advertisement out of the paper. She had read them again before she wrote her first letter. She had said them to Rosie on the morning they boarded the train in Philadelphia, as a kind of promise, as a kind of proof. Children welcome. She was thinking about that, about how a man can write 2 words and mean them completely in the moment and then never think about them again, when she heard the horse. She didn't hear it clearly at first. The storm had built a wall of sound around them, wind and rain and the creak of the cottonwood branches overhead, and the horse was coming from the east, which meant it was moving into the wind, and the sound was scattered and broken. But it was a horse. She was certain. She stood up. "Stay here," she told Rosie. "Mama, right here. Don't move." She stepped out from under the tarp and into the rain, which immediately made the last hour of cold feel like a warm memory. She could see maybe 30 feet in front of her. Everything beyond that was gray and moving. She waved her arms. She felt ridiculous. She felt desperate. She kept waving. The horse materialized out of the rain like something that hadn't quite decided to exist yet, and the man on it pulled up hard when he saw her, and for a long moment they simply looked at each other while the storm moved around them like it had somewhere else to be. He was not a young man, but not an old one either, somewhere in the difficult middle years that don't photograph well and don't describe easily. He had the kind of face that had been outside in Wyoming for a long time. His coat was soaked through despite being heavy canvas, which told her he'd been out in this for a while. His horse was a good animal, dark and rangy, moving with controlled anxiety under the weather. He did not look like a threat. He also did not look like a rescue. He looked like someone who had made a wrong turn and was now reconsidering several decisions simultaneously. "Who are you?" he said. The question was not unkind, but it was direct in a way that told her he was not going to waste time on pleasantries with the storm doing what it was doing. "Margaret Holloway," she said. "I have a child." Something shifted in his expression, not softening exactly, more like recalibration. "How long have you been out here?" 2 hours, maybe more." He looked at the tarp between the cottonwoods. He looked at her. He looked at the sky, which was not improving. "My ranch is 3 miles north," he said. There's a cabin, dry." "We don't know you," she said. "No," he agreed. "You don't. You don't know us either." "No." He held her gaze. "I know you've been standing in this storm for 2 hours with a child. That's enough." She studied him for another moment. She thought about every warning she'd ever received about trusting strangers. She thought about the canyon between what those warnings assumed. That you had options, that you had somewhere else to go, that the alternative to a stranger was something safer, and what was actually true right now, which was a 5-year-old with soaked shoes and no food in a stand of cottonwoods in a Wyoming storm. "What's your name?" she said. "Nathan Colebrook." She nodded once. "I'll get my daughter." His name was Nathan Colebrook, and he had been ranching alone in the Wyoming Territory for 7 years, which had given him several things: a good knowledge of weather, a working distrust of people who talked too much, a horse he trusted completely, and almost no experience with children. He watched the small girl emerge from behind the tarp. Her face was pale and serious, and her shoes made a sound like wet bread when she walked, and something in his chest did a thing he didn't examine. He helped Margaret onto the horse first, then Rosie, then climbed up behind them, which was not comfortable for anyone, but was warmer than the alternative. The horse registered a complaint about the arrangement and then accepted it with the dignity of an animal that has survived worse. Margaret did not speak for the first mile. Nathan did not speak either. There were ranchers who filled silence with noise because silence made them nervous. Nathan had spent enough time alone that silence was simply the default state of things. He'd learned to hear what was in it. The specific weight of Rosie's body against his arm when she stopped shivering and started simply enduring, which was different and worse. The way Margaret sat in front of him with her back straight despite everything. The particular straightness of someone who had decided not to fall apart yet. "The man who was supposed to meet you," Nathan said finally. "Whitmore." He felt her shoulders shift, not a flinch, more like adjusting to new weight. "You know him," she said. "I know who he is." "And?" Nathan thought about how to say what he knew about Walter Whitmore in a way that was accurate without being cruel to a woman sitting in a wet coat 3 miles from his ranch with nowhere else to go. "He's not a reliable man," he said. Margaret gave a short sound that might have been a laugh in other weather. "No," she said. "He is not." Rosie had fallen asleep against Nathan's arm by the time they reached the ranch, which told him something about how tired she was, because she hadn't closed her eyes the whole ride despite the cold and the rain and every reason to be afraid. She'd been watching the dark, watching the road, watching everything with those careful eyes, and then she'd simply run out of capacity and gone under. He handed her down to Margaret while he dismounted and then carried her himself to the cabin door because Margaret's hands were shaking too badly to manage both Rosie and the latch. He didn't say anything about the shaking. She didn't say anything about him noticing. The cabin was not large. It was not beautiful. It had a fireplace that worked well, a wood stove in the corner with a flat top for cooking, a table with 2 chairs, and a narrow bed against the far wall. It smelled like wood smoke and pine resin, and something underneath that was just the smell of a place where one person had been alone for too long. Nathan built the fire up without being asked, while Margaret got Rosie's wet things off her and wrapped her in the heavy wool blanket from the bed. He found dry socks in the chest by the door, his own, enormous on a child, and brought them over without comment. Rosie woke up briefly when her feet were being attended to. She looked at Nathan. Nathan looked at her. "Your house is small," she said. "Rosie," Margaret said, her voice carrying the particular exhausted apology of a mother who had run out of energy to be embarrassed, but was trying anyway. "It is small," Nathan agreed. "One person doesn't need much." Rosie considered the fire. "Are you lonely?" "Rosie." "It's all right," Nathan said. He sat back on his heels and looked at the child with the directness she seemed to expect. "Sometimes. You stop noticing after a while." "I noticed," Rosie said. "When Mama and I were in the other room, at Aunt Clara's, I noticed when it was quiet in a sad way instead of a peaceful way. There's a difference." Nathan looked at her for a moment. "Yes?" he said. "There is." Rosie nodded, satisfied, and closed her eyes again. Margaret had been watching this exchange from across the small room. She was sitting on the floor near the fire with the blanket draped over her shoulders, her hair still damp, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of water that wasn't hot yet but was warmer than everything else. She looked like a woman trying very hard not to feel things in front of a stranger. "Thank you," she said, "for stopping." "You were waving your arms in a storm," he said. "It would take a particular kind of man to ride past that." "Some men would." "Yes," he said. "Some would." He sat down in one of the chairs and looked at the fire, because it was easier than looking at her. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet." She said it without hesitation, which surprised him. He'd expected her to have an answer prepared, something defensive, a plan she could put forward to prove she wasn't asking for anything. Instead, she just said it plain. "I don't know yet. I have some money, not much. Enough to find somewhere to stay while I figure out the next thing." "In Laramie?" "I don't have anywhere particular in mind. Laramie's not a bad town. There's work." "For a woman alone with a child?" He didn't answer that, because they both knew the answer. The fire cracked and settled. Outside, the storm was still building, which meant it hadn't peaked yet, which meant the 3 of them were going to be in this small cabin for some time longer, regardless of what any of them preferred. Nathan looked at the narrow bed where Rosie was sleeping, and at the floor where Margaret was sitting, and at the single chair that was his usual place, and he did the arithmetic. "You take the bed," he said. "Both of you. We've already imposed. The floor's fine for one night. I've slept on worse." He stood up and moved toward the corner. "Get warm. Sleep. Tomorrow we can figure out what comes next." Margaret watched him for a moment with the expression of someone who is not sure whether to be grateful or suspicious and has decided that being tired is more urgent than being either. "Mr. Colebrook," she said. "Nathan." "Nathan." She looked at her daughter's sleeping face, the slack, complete surrender of a child who has finally decided it's safe enough to let go. "What made you stop? Really? You could have kept riding. The storm was bad. You had your own place to get to." Nathan thought about this honestly, the way he tried to think about most things, not looking for the answer that sounded right, but for the one that was true. "I saw you standing there," he said, "and I saw her." He paused, and I thought, whatever situation put them there, they didn't put themselves there, and someone needed to decide what kind of man I was going to be about it. Margaret Holloway looked at him for a long moment. "That's a decent answer," she said. "It's the only one I had." She turned back to the fire. He settled into the corner with his blanket and his coat and the particular stoic discomfort of a man who has been cold and wet before and knows it ends. Outside, the storm moved west, carrying with it the last of the day and the last of whatever Margaret Holloway had believed about how her life was going to go. It left behind, in its wake, a small warm room with a sleeping child and two adults who were strangers and the specific fragile silence of something that had not yet decided what it was going to become. She did not know his history. He did not know hers. He did not know that she had been married once before, briefly and badly, to Rosie's father, a man whose name she no longer said out loud. He did not know what it had cost her to sit down and write that first careful letter to Walter Whitmore, what it had taken to make herself trust the possibility of something better. He did not know what it felt like to get on a train with a 5-year-old and everything you owned packed into a trunk and point yourself toward a future that existed only in someone else's handwriting. She did not know that he had come to Wyoming from Ohio with a brother who had not survived the first winter. She did not know that the extra chair at his table had been there for 6 years and he had never moved it. She did not know that the silence Rosie had identified, the sad kind, not the peaceful kind, was something he had lived inside for so long he'd started to think it was just the way things were. But Rosie knew. Rosie, 5 years old and asleep in a borrowed blanket, had walked into that cabin and looked at it and named exactly what it was, and Nathan Colebrook, who had not been named in 7 years, sat in his corner with that knowledge sitting somewhere behind his sternum like an ember that wasn't sure yet if it was going to catch. The fire burned low. The storm eased by degrees. The ranch was quiet in the way that ranches are quiet when the animals have settled and the wind has dropped and there is nothing left to do but wait for whatever morning brings. Margaret Holloway did not sleep right away. She lay beside her daughter and listened to the fire and thought about the letter in her pocket and the 8 words that had ended one life and dropped her into this one. And she thought about the rancher asleep in the corner who had stopped in a storm without being asked. And she thought about Walter Whitmore somewhere warm and dry with whatever wealthy woman had offered him a better arrangement. And she thought that the strangest thing about losing everything was how it clarified what mattered and what didn't, how all the things she'd been afraid of losing, the house she'd imagined, the husband she'd believed in, the respectability of arriving somewhere as a promised woman rather than a stranded one, none of it was what she felt the loss of. What she felt was simpler than that. She felt the weight of her daughter beside her. She felt the warmth of a fire built by a stranger who hadn't needed to build it. She thought, I don't know what happens next. Then she thought, I know how to not know. I've done it before. Outside the cabin, the horses in the paddock moved in the dark, and the prairie lay under the storm's aftermath, wet and black and indifferent to everything. And somewhere 4 miles south, at the crossroads where Margaret had stood with her daughter and her trunk and Walter Whitmore's 8 words, the rain washed the crossroads post clean, and the mud filled in the wheel ruts where the wagon had been, and by morning there would be no sign that anyone had waited there at all. But the people who had waited were still here. That was the thing about the frontier that the people back east never fully grasped when they read about it in their newspapers and their novels. It did not care what your plans were. It did not reward the prepared or punish the unlucky with any particular consistency. It simply was what it was. And you were what you were, and what happened next depended entirely on what you decided to do with the intersection of those 2 facts. Margaret Holloway closed her eyes. She had no idea, lying in that narrow bed in that small cabin on Nathan Colebrook's isolated ranch, that this was the beginning of something. She only knew she was still here, and so was Rosie. And for tonight, against every reasonable expectation, that was enough. Morning came the way mornings do after bad storms. Not gently, but suddenly, the light arriving all at once as if the sky were making up for lost time. Nathan was already outside when Margaret woke. She could hear him through the thin cabin walls, the scrape of boots on frozen mud, the low, steady voice he used with the horses. Not words exactly, but something that functioned like words, a rhythmic reassurance that said, I'm here, I see you, settle down. Rosie was still asleep. Margaret lay still for a moment and let herself feel the full weight of where she was. The blanket smelled like wood smoke. The fire had burned down to coals. Her coat was draped over the foot of the bed where she'd spread it the night before, and it was almost dry, which meant she'd slept longer than she thought. Through the small window above the bed, she could see a strip of sky the color of pewter going slowly pale at the edges. She got up. She found the wood stove and the tin box of kindling beside it, and built the fire back up the way her grandmother had taught her. Not the way anyone in Philadelphia had ever needed to know, but her grandmother had come from Kentucky and believed that a woman who couldn't build a fire from coals was a woman who would die waiting for someone else to do it. She found a coffee pot and ground beans in a hand mill mounted to the wall near the door and had water heating before she let herself think about what she was going to do today. The problem with crises, she had learned, was that they had a before and an after, and the after was always harder than the before, because the before at least had urgency in it, and urgency kept you moving. The after just had reality. The reality was this. She was in a stranger's cabin in Wyoming with $5.37, no trunk, no connections, no place to go, and a 5-year-old daughter who would wake up hungry and need feeding, and would almost certainly at some point in the morning ask a question Margaret didn't have an answer for. She poured the coffee when it was ready and stood by the window and watched Nathan Colebrook work. He moved around the ranch yard with the particular efficiency of a man who did the same things every morning, in the same order, and had stopped thinking about them consciously years ago. He fed the horses. He checked the fence line along the near paddock where 2 posts had leaned badly in the storm. He pumped water from the well and carried it across the yard without spilling it, which sounds simple and is not simple when the ground is uneven and frozen in patches, and your arms are already full. He did all of this without looking toward the cabin window. Margaret had the distinct impression this was deliberate. She respected it. She heard Rosie stir behind her and turned. "Is there food?" Rosie asked. She asked this before she opened her eyes, which was simply how Rosie organized priorities. "I'm going to find some." "I'm very hungry." "I heard you the first time." "I didn't say it the first time." "You were thinking it very loudly," Margaret said. "I could hear it." Rosie opened her eyes and looked at the cabin with the calm assessment of a child cataloging a new place. She looked at the wood stove and the table and the 2 chairs and the extra chair and the tools hung on the wall beside the door and the single shelf above the fireplace with its 4 books and its tin cup holding pencils. "He lives here alone," she said. "Yes, he's been here a long time." "Probably." Rosie sat up and looked at her shoes, still slightly damp from the night before, lined up beside the bed the way Margaret always placed them. "I like him," she said. "You don't know him." "I know he stopped," Rosie said. "That's the important part." Margaret opened her mouth, found she didn't have a response to that, and went to look for food. There wasn't much. Nathan's pantry was the pantry of a man who cooked for himself and didn't enjoy doing it. Dried beans, salt pork, cornmeal, a half wheel of hard cheese wrapped in cloth, some dried apples going leathery in a paper bag. Margaret found eggs in a crate near the back wall, 8 of them, and made do with that and the cornmeal and the last of the cheese. And by the time Nathan came through the door, she had food on the table, and Rosie was sitting in one of the chairs with her hands folded like she was about to say grace, except she had been told since she was 2 that they didn't do that. Nathan stopped in the doorway. He looked at the table. He looked at Margaret. "You didn't need to," he started. "I used your eggs and some of the cornmeal," she said. "I'll replace what I took before I go." He came in and hung his coat and hat and sat down at the table. He looked at the food. He looked at the coffee, already poured and waiting. "I haven't had a hot breakfast in—" He stopped. "Thank you." "You stopped in a storm," she said. "It's the least a person can do." They ate. Rosie ate with the focused intensity of a child who has been told enough times to have manners at the table that she's learned the trick of having them while still eating everything in front of her as fast as possible without technically rushing. Nathan ate without talking, which Margaret had already figured was simply how he was. Not rudeness, but a different relationship to silence than most people had. Halfway through the meal, Rosie said, "What are those books for?" Nathan looked at the shelf. "Reading." "What are they about?" "One's about cattle, one's about farming, one's about the law, one's a story." "Which story?" "Moby Dick." Rosie considered this. "Is it good?" "Parts of it," Nathan said. "The whale parts are good. There's a lot in the middle that isn't." Rosie nodded sagely. "Mama says that about most things." Nathan looked at Margaret. Margaret looked at her eggs. "The ranch," she said, changing the subject. "How long have you had it?" 7 years. "Alone the whole time?" A pause. My brother was here the first year. She waited for more. None came. She filed the information and left it where it was. I need to get to Laramie, she said. Today, if possible. I need to find a boarding house, start looking for work. If you know anyone going that direction. Road'll be bad this morning, Nathan said. After a storm like that, the low ground floods. Best to wait until afternoon. I can't impose on you until afternoon. You're not imposing. You're sitting at a table eating breakfast. He looked at her directly for the first time that morning. He had gray eyes, she noticed, the particular gray of overcast sky that is not unpleasant, but does not invite you to underestimate it. I didn't mean it as a favor. I meant it practically. The road's impassable until the water recedes. She held his gaze. And if I wanted to try it anyway? I'd tell you the creek crossing 3 miles south runs 6 feet deep after heavy rain, and you'd be turning back within the hour. He picked up his coffee. Stay until afternoon. The road'll be clear by then, and I'll take you myself. Margaret thought about arguing, recognized it as the particular stubbornness of a woman who had been made to feel like a burden so many times that she'd developed a reflex against accepting help even when refusing it was simply stupid, and made herself stop. Thank you, she said. It's practical, he said again. Rosie looked between them with the expression of a child watching a conversation that had more layers than the words being used, and said nothing, which was itself a kind of commentary. That afternoon, Nathan drove them into Laramie in his wagon, which was not a comfortable vehicle but was functional, with a bench wide enough for 2 adults and a child between them. The road was exactly as bad as he'd said it would be, rutted and soft and requiring constant attention from a driver who knew where the solid ground ran and where it didn't. Margaret watched him navigate it and understood why he'd said what he'd said that morning, and was briefly grateful she hadn't wasted her pride on trying it alone. Laramie in October was a working town, which meant it was not a pretty town. It had a main street with a general store and a land office and a blacksmith and a saloon and a church and a doctor's office, and a building that advertised itself as a hotel but was clearly a boarding house with ambitions. There were people on the street who looked at Nathan's wagon with the casual appraisal of people who knew everyone and noticed changes. They looked at Margaret and Rosie with something more focused than that. She felt it the way you feel weather. Not one thing you could point to, but a general atmospheric condition that told you what kind of day you were having. Nathan tied the wagon outside the general store and helped Rosie down, and then stood back while Margaret climbed down herself. The boarding house is Mrs. Aldrich's, he said, nodding toward the building at the end of the street. She's not warm, but she's fair, and she keeps a clean house. Tell her I sent you. Will that help or hurt? He thought about this honestly. Depends on the day, he said, but mostly help. Margaret looked at him. Why would your name carry weight in town if you live 3 miles out and keep to yourself? I pay my debts, he said simply. In this territory, that's enough. She nodded. She looked at the boarding house. She looked at Rosie, who had found a loose stone in the road and was investigating it with great seriousness. Rosie, she said, come. They went to see Mrs. Aldrich. Mrs. Aldrich was a woman of 60-something who had clearly been someone's very strict schoolteacher in a previous life and had carried the posture and the evaluative gaze into retirement. She looked at Margaret. She looked at Rosie. She looked at the $5.37 Margaret laid on the counter and did arithmetic. 2 weeks, she said, for the smaller room. After that, you either pay more or find other arrangements. I understand. I don't allow disruptions after 8 in the evening. We won't be a disruption. Children often are. Margaret looked at Rosie. Rosie looked at Mrs. Aldrich with the careful, serious expression she used for adults who were making assessments. I'm not usually loud, Rosie said, unless something is very surprising. I try to be ready for surprising things so I don't have to make noise about them. Mrs. Aldrich studied the child for a moment. Room's on the 2nd floor, she said. End of the hall. Don't leave the lamp burning past 10. They moved into the room that afternoon. It was small, with a bed and a washstand and a window that looked out onto the alley behind the building, and it smelled like lye soap and old wood. And it was exactly what it needed to be, which was dry and safe and theirs for 2 weeks. Margaret sat on the bed after Rosie fell asleep that night and counted her money 3 times, as if counting it more would change it, and then she made a list in her head of what she needed to find and in what order. Work first. Then regularity. Then enough stability that Rosie could stop waking in the night reaching for her hand. She would not write to her sister. Clara had been generous with the back room and strained about it, the specific generosity of someone who gives what they have while hoping they won't have to keep giving it. And Margaret had promised herself she wouldn't go back in that direction. She would not think about Walter Whitmore. She had decided this. She thought about him anyway, briefly, and then made herself stop. The next morning, she went to every business on the main street and asked about work. The general store had nothing. The hotel boarding house where she already lived needed no one. The doctor's office had a receptionist. The land office had never employed a woman, and the man behind the desk looked at her as if she'd asked him something in a foreign language. She was coming out of the dry goods store, nothing there either, when she heard her name. She turned. The woman who had said it was standing across the street in front of the seamstress's shop, and she was looking at Margaret with an expression that was not quite recognition and not quite the other thing. "You're the woman Nathan Colebrook brought in yesterday," she said. Not a question. "I am," Margaret said. "I'm June Harlow." She was perhaps 40, with practical hair and practical clothes, and the kind of face that had opinions about things and didn't work particularly hard to conceal them. "I own the seamstress shop. I heard you were looking for work." Margaret felt something in her chest go careful and still. Word travels. "This is a small town," June said. "Nathan Colebrook bringing in a strange woman and child from the storm is the most interesting thing that's happened here in a month. You're all anyone talked about at church this morning." She paused. "Can you sew?" "I worked at a dress shop in Philadelphia for 3 years." June looked at her with recalibrated interest. "Not mending. Actual construction?" "Bodices, skirts, alterations, basic pattern drafting. I'm not a designer, but I'm fast and I'm accurate." June studied her. "I have a backlog. Christmas orders are already coming in, and my girl who was helping me left in August to get married." She named a wage that was not generous and was not insulting. 4 days a week to start. See how it goes? Margaret thought about Mrs. Aldrich's 2-week deadline. She thought about 37 cents. "When do I start?" she said. "Monday," June said. 7 in the morning. This was how Margaret Holloway came to be known in Laramie. Not as the failed mail-order bride, though people knew that story and said it in whispers, but as the woman at June Harlow's shop who could finish a bodice in an afternoon and whose seams didn't pull. It was not a reputation that made people love her, but it made them respect the work, which in a working town was close enough to the same thing. The whispers existed anyway. She heard them in the way you hear things that people intend you to hear, just at the edge of audible, in the moment when they think you're not listening. That's her. The one Walter Whitmore left at the crossroads, brought a child with her, some story about a husband who died. Nathan Colebrook took them in. You know what that means. She kept her face forward and her hands busy and let the whispers be what they were. She had lived in a row house in Philadelphia long enough to know that the only cure for other people's opinions was time, and time required you to keep showing up until the story stopped being interesting. Rosie was harder to manage. The children in town had their own system of social evaluation, different from the adults but no less rigorous, and Rosie arrived in the middle of it at an age when the systems were already established, and she was the variable nobody had accounted for. There were 2 girls on Mrs. Aldrich's street who would have been kind if they'd been alone but weren't alone, and there were 3 boys near the school who had clearly heard the story about the crossroads from their parents and considered it fair material for the particular casual cruelty of 9-year-old boys. Margaret found out about this not from Rosie, who said nothing, but from the state of Rosie's shoes one afternoon, muddy in a pattern that suggested she'd been running rather than walking, which was different from the deliberate mud of a child at play. "What happened?" Margaret asked. "Nothing." "Your shoes didn't go running by themselves." Rosie looked at the shoes. "The Denny boys followed me from the schoolyard. I didn't want to walk slow while they were following me." "Did they touch you?" "No, they just said things." "What things?" Rosie picked at a thread on her sleeve in the way she did when she was deciding how much to say. "That we were charity cases. That Mr. Colebrook felt sorry for us." A pause. "That women who get left at crossroads usually end up in the saloon." Margaret's hands had gone still on the table.
Those boys are repeating what they heard from their fathers, she said, and her voice was even only because she'd had years of practice making it even when other things were happening underneath. I know, Rosie said. That's what made it worse. They didn't even think of it themselves. Margaret looked at her daughter, this 5-year-old child who processed the world with the unsentimental clarity of someone who had never been able to afford the luxury of illusion, and felt the particular grief of a mother who cannot protect her child from what is true. People talk, she said finally, and some of what they say is ugly, and some of it is ignorant, and almost none of it is about you. It's about them, about what makes them feel like they're standing somewhere solid by putting someone else on lower ground. I know that too, Rosie said. Then what do you need from me? Rosie thought about this. I don't know yet, she said.
I think I just needed to say it to someone. You can always say it to me. Rosie nodded. Then she looked up with that small, sideways look she had when she was about to say something that mattered more than how she was saying it. Can we go see Mr. Colebrook sometime? Margaret blinked. Why? He didn't say anything about the crossroads, Rosie said. He just came. Margaret Holloway sat with that for a long moment. 2 weeks became 3, and 3 became a month, and the money from June's shop was enough to pay Mrs. Aldrich and buy food and keep Rosie in shoes that fit, which was all it was enough for and precisely what Margaret had needed it to be enough for. She was not comfortable. She was not settled. But she was upright, and she had learned a long time ago that upright was the thing you fought for first, and comfort was something you built on top of it later if you got the chance. Nathan Colebrook came into town on the 3rd Saturday of November. She saw him first from the window of June's shop, where she was finishing the last seam on a holiday dress for the land office manager's wife. He was tying his horse outside the general store, which was where he always went first when he came in. She'd seen him twice before from that same window and noted the pattern. He moved the same way he had in the storm, without hurry, without the particular swagger some men put on in town like a second coat. She went back to the seam. 15 minutes later, June appeared in the doorway. Nathan Colebrook's asking for you. Margaret looked up. Out front, June said. She was carefully neutral in the way she always was about Nathan, which was itself a kind of information. He's got something in the wagon. It was the trunk, her trunk, the one she'd told Abe Cutter to keep or leave or do whatever he wanted with. It was sitting in Nathan's wagon, battered, its brass fittings dark with weather, but intact. Nathan was standing beside it with his hands in his coat pockets. Cutter felt bad, he said. Drove it back to the crossroads when the storm cleared. Didn't know where else to leave it. I found it there 2 days later. Margaret stood on the step outside June's shop and looked at the trunk. She thought about what was in it. Rosie's second dress, the blue wool one that was already getting short. A photograph of her own mother. The small tin box with the letters she'd kept because she hadn't been ready yet to do what she needed to do with them. 3 books, a set of good scissors. She looked at Nathan. Thank you, she said. Cutter's the one who felt bad, he said, but you're the one who brought it. He didn't have an answer for that. He looked at the wagon, looked at the street, looked somewhere between the two. How are you getting on? Working, she said. Managing. Rosie? She's resilient. She paused. She asks about the ranch. Something in Nathan's face moved. Not much, just a small shift at the corner of one eye. Does she? She remembers things specifically, the horses' names, the way the fire sounded. She paid attention. She always does. Margaret looked down the street toward the boarding house. I told her we couldn't impose. I told you, I know what you told me. She looked at him. But she's been imposed on enough. Both of us have. I don't want her growing up expecting that people who showed you kindness once are required to keep doing it. That's not how the world works, and the sooner she understands it, the better off she'll be. Nathan was quiet for a moment. That's a harder lesson than she needs at 5. Most real lessons are. He looked at her with the gray sky eyes that didn't give much away but absorbed everything. Come out on Sunday, he said. Bring her. There's a horse she's probably too small to ride, but she can meet. We'll have lunch. That's not necessary. Margaret. It was the first time he'd used her name directly, and the plainness of it stopped her. "She's 5 years old. She's in a boarding house room with nothing to do on a Sunday. Come out to the ranch." She looked at him for a long moment. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. They stood there on the street in front of June Harlow's shop with the battered trunk between them and the November wind cutting down the main street, and neither of them said anything else. And it was the first time since the storm that Margaret Holloway had been in the same silence as Nathan Colebrook and not felt the need to fill it. Sunday was cold but clear, and Rosie sat beside Margaret in Nathan's wagon on the way out to the ranch and asked 11 questions in the first mile, which was normal, and then went quiet and watched the prairie roll out around them with the specific attention she gave to things that interested her, which was the attention of someone who is not just looking, but storing. The ranch looked different in daylight, smaller and larger at the same time. Smaller because you could see its edges, the fence lines and the paddock, and the cabin sitting compact and low against the land, but larger because the land around it went on in all directions without apology. And in October light, it was the color of dried hay and old gold and something that didn't have a word in the languages Margaret knew. Rosie got down from the wagon before it had fully stopped and went straight to the fence, where a dark horse with a white mark on its nose was watching her approach with cautious interest. "What's her name?" Rosie called back. "His name is Dusk," Nathan said. "Hello, Dusk," Rosie said, in exactly the same tone she would have used to greet a new neighbor. The horse came forward and put his nose against the fence rail, and Rosie put her hand out flat the way Margaret didn't remember teaching her, and he breathed on it, and Rosie smiled in a way that was different from her regular smile. Less considered, less guarded, the smile of a child who has found something that asked nothing of her and gave everything anyway. Margaret stood by the wagon and watched and felt something crack open in her chest in the quiet way that things break when they've been held too tightly for too long. Inside, Nathan had a pot of beans on the stove that had been going since morning, and there was cornbread in the pan beside it. And it was not fine food, but it was hot, and there was enough of it. And the three of them sat at the table and ate with the particular ease of people who have already been through something hard together and don't need to perform normalcy because normalcy has already been established by survival. Rosie ate her beans and then looked at the bookshelf. "Can I look at the books?" she asked Nathan. "Go ahead." She got down from her chair and went to the shelf and stood on her toes to reach the highest book, which was the one with the whale. "This one is long," she said, opening it with appropriate gravity. "Very long. Will you read some of it to me?" Nathan looked up from his bowl. He looked at Margaret. Margaret looked at her own bowl. "After lunch," he said. They stayed until the sun started dropping and the temperature with it, and then Margaret said they had to get back before dark. And there was a brief negotiation between Rosie and the general concept of leaving that Rosie lost in the expected way, and then they were back in the wagon with the last light going copper and long across the prairie. Rosie was asleep before they reached the main road, leaning against Margaret's arm with her mouth slightly open and the particular bonelessness of a deeply sleeping child. Nathan drove and said nothing. Margaret watched the road and said nothing. After a while she said, "She hasn't slept like that in a month." Nathan said nothing. "She wakes up," Margaret said, "at night, reaches for me. I think she doesn't know for a moment where she is." "That'll pass," Nathan said. "I know." She looked at her sleeping daughter. "I just want it to pass faster." He nodded. They drove on. "You could come back," he said. "Weekends, when the shop's closed. She could see the horse." "Nathan, she could help with the garden in spring if she wanted. There's going to be more work than I can manage alone, and I'd pay fair wages." He said it all looking at the road, practical, even, the way he said most things. "I'm not suggesting it as charity. I'm short-handed, and she's—" He stopped. "You're good workers. I can tell from watching how you managed the morning we left." It was not a declaration. It was not even a confession. It was Nathan Colebrook telling her something true in the only register he seemed to have, which was direct and undecorated and completely without strategy. Margaret looked at his profile in the fading light, the set of his jaw. The slight lean forward that she'd noticed was how he sat when he was concentrating, when something mattered, and he didn't want to miss any of it. "We'll think about it," she said. He nodded once and drove on, and the lights of Laramie came up slowly ahead of them through the dusk, and Rosie slept against her mother's arm, and the prairie settled into its cold, dark distances around them, enormous and indifferent and full of the particular kind of silence that only exists in places where the sky is very big, and the human things in it are very small but present nonetheless, present and warm, and, for the first time in longer than she could easily say, not entirely alone. They did think about it. Margaret thought about it for 3 days, which was 2 days longer than she needed, and 1 day shorter than it took her to stop arguing with herself about what the right answer was. The argument went the way those arguments always go when you already know what you're going to decide but haven't yet made peace with knowing it, circular, exhausting, arriving back at the same place every time. The practical case was simple. June's shop paid enough to keep them in the boarding house and not enough to do anything beyond that. Winter was coming in hard from the north, and the boarding house was drafty in ways that Mrs. Aldrich had declined to address, despite 2 polite mentions. Rosie needed space that a second-floor room on an alley couldn't give her. And Nathan had offered wages, real wages for real work, and his offer had been made in the direct, undecorated way that she had come to understand was simply how he said things. Not performance, not calculation, just the plain statement of what was true. The part that wasn't practical was harder to name. It was the part that said, "You have been burned once already by depending on a man's word." It was the part that said, "Rosie is already attached to that horse and that cabin and that particular silence that isn't lonely, and if this goes wrong, it will cost her more than it will cost you." It was the part that said, "You don't know enough about Nathan Colebrook yet, and what you do know makes you trust him. And trusting people is exactly what got you to that crossroads in the storm." On the 4th day, she went to June's shop and gave 2 weeks' notice. June looked at her for a moment. "The ranch," she said. "He needs help through winter. The wages are fair." "They would be," June said. "Nathan's fair about money. He's fair about most things." She rolled a seam and didn't look up. "He's also not easy." "I'm not looking for easy," Margaret said. June looked up then. "No," she said, with the tone of someone revising an assessment. "I don't suppose you are." They moved to the ranch on the first Saturday of December, which was colder than any Saturday Margaret had ever experienced in her life, and which Rosie described as like being inside a cloud that decided to be mean about it. Nathan had cleared the small room off the back of the cabin. It had been used for storage, she could tell from the nail holes and the way the space smelled like old leather and rust, and put a bed in it and a small stove that vented through the wall. And it was not large, but it had a door that closed and a window that faced east, so the morning light came in first thing, which mattered more than she would have expected. The arrangement was understood between them without being stated explicitly, the way certain things between adults in close quarters have to be understood, or else the close quarters become impossible. She and Rosie had their room, Nathan had his. She would cook because she was the better cook and because it was practical, not because it was her obligation. He would handle the heavy outdoor work and teach her what she needed to know about the rest. She would do the mending and the garden work and help where help was needed. He would pay her on the 1st of each month, the same as he'd said. What none of this addressed was the fact that they were now living in the same small cabin through a Wyoming winter, which meant close proximity and shared meals and the accumulated knowledge of another person's habits that comes whether you seek it or not. She learned that he woke before light, always, without visible effort, as if sleeping past 4 in the morning was something his body had simply decided wasn't available. She learned that he drank his coffee standing up for the first cup and sitting down for the second, and that the transition between the two was roughly when he became capable of conversation. She learned that he was meticulous about certain things. The tools always hung in the same order, the horses always checked in the same sequence, and entirely indifferent about others, notably his own coat, which he would leave anywhere and then spend 10 minutes looking for it until she started hanging it on the peg by the door without mentioning that she was doing this. He learned things about her too. She knew this not because he said anything, but because of the way his behavior adjusted in small, specific ways. He started leaving the coffee pot on the stove after his second cup because she preferred it hot and not reheated. He stopped leaving the cabin door ajar when the temperature dropped below a certain point, which he'd done out of habit, a habit that had never mattered when he lived alone and mattered now when Rosie slept in the room with the east window. He did these things without comment and apparently without needing acknowledgement, which was both easier to live with than she'd expected, and, in a way she had trouble articulating, something more unsettling than difficulty would have been. Rosie adapted to ranch life with the specific flexibility of children who have already survived adaptation once and have developed a system for it. She learned the horses by the end of the first week. She learned which parts of the fence were her domain and which were not. She learned that Nathan would answer any question she asked him with full seriousness, which meant that she asked him many questions about the horses and the weather and the land and what had happened to his brother and whether Dusk had always had the white mark on his nose. That last one stopped him briefly. His mother had it, Nathan said. Do you miss her? The mare? Your brother, Rosie said. Nathan was checking the paddock gate when she asked it, and he did not stop checking the gate. His hands kept doing what they were doing, but there was a pause in him, not in motion, but in the particular aliveness of a person who is present, something that went still for a moment. Yes, he said. Rosie nodded. I miss my father sometimes, she said, even though I didn't know him well. I think you can miss a shape of a thing, even when you don't have all the details filled in. Nathan looked at her. That's an exact way to put it. Mama says I think in exact ways. She patted the gatepost the same way she patted the horses, a gesture of uncomplicated affection. I'm sorry about your brother. It was a long time ago, Nathan said. I know, Rosie said. It still counts. She walked back to the cabin, and Nathan Colebrook stood at his paddock gate for a moment longer than the gate required, and Margaret, who had heard all of this from the cabin window where she was mending a pair of his work gloves, put down the gloves and pressed her fingers against her eyes and thought, this child is going to be someone extraordinary, and I am going to spend the rest of my life trying to deserve having been her mother. December settled in with the particular seriousness of Wyoming winter, which is to say it was not the kind of cold that apologizes for itself or takes holidays. It was the kind of cold that required planning, wood stacked deep, food stores checked and rechecked, the animals' needs accounted for before anyone's comfort was considered. Margaret had never lived like this, in the direct daily negotiation with weather that frontier life required, where a warm day was not a pleasure, but a signal to accomplish something that cold would prevent. She learned fast because the alternative was to be useless, and being useless was not something her nature permitted. Nathan taught her how to read the sky, not the pretty version where clouds mean something romantic, but the functional version, where color and movement and the direction of wind told you whether you had 4 hours or 40 minutes to finish the work outside. He taught her what the animals needed through cold, and how their behavior told you when something was wrong. He taught her how to manage the wood stove for long burns rather than hot, short ones, which was a different skill than it sounded like. She taught him, without meaning to, what it was like to have people in a house. He was not unfamiliar with this exactly. He'd had his brother, and before that a family in Ohio, but 7 years was a long time, and he'd grown into his aloneness the way things grow into the shape of their container, fitting it so completely that it stopped feeling like a shape and started feeling like a form. Meals at a set time. The sound of Rosie's voice asking questions at all hours. The lamp burning in the back room at night while Margaret read or mended. Small things. The kind that don't announce themselves as significant until they've already changed something. It was in the 3rd week of December that the news about Walter Whitmore came to the ranch, carried by a man named Dolph Garrett, who ran the feed supply outside Laramie and who had business with Nathan every winter. Dolph was the kind of man who liked being the one with information, not maliciously but constitutionally. He was built for it, with a big voice and an easy manner and the narrative instinct of someone who had been the most entertaining person in every room he'd been in since he was 12. He arrived on a Tuesday with a wagon of winter feed and the following information. Walter Whitmore had announced his engagement to a Miss Eleanor Stokes, daughter of a land investor from Cheyenne who had recently acquired 3 adjacent ranches and was, according to Dolph, putting together something considerable out east of the river. He delivered this intelligence to Nathan while Margaret was in the barn checking on the younger horse's left foreleg, which had been favoring it slightly for 2 days. She came back into the yard while Dolph was still talking, and she caught the tail end of it, and she stopped walking. She stood in the yard with the cold coming down on her from a flat white sky, and she heard Whitmore's name and Stokes's name and the word engagement, and she felt a very specific thing that she had not expected to feel, which was not grief and not anger, but something that sat in the exact space between them, a settling, like something that had been leaning, finally deciding to fall. Dolph noticed her. "Beg your pardon," he said, with the expression of a man who has just realized he's said something in front of someone it was going to land on. "Ma'am, I didn't mean—" "It's all right," she said. Her voice was her normal voice. She was aware of this and grateful for it. "You weren't saying anything I didn't already know the shape of." Dolph looked between her and Nathan with the slightly desperate expression of a man who wants very much to be somewhere else. Nathan looked at Margaret. She met his gaze briefly, then looked at Dolph. "The left foreleg on the young bay needs looking at," she said to Nathan. "I think it's the hoof, not the joint. Can you take a look before Dolph goes?" "Sure," Nathan said. Dolph left an hour later looking relieved, and the ranch was quiet again, and Rosie was at the table in the cabin with the whale book open in front of her, copying letters out of it onto a piece of brown paper with a pencil stub, which was the game she'd invented for herself in the absence of formal school. Margaret stood in the middle of the yard for a moment after Dolph's wagon disappeared. Nathan came up beside her. "You all right?" he said. "Yes." "You don't have to be." She looked at the horizon, which was the color of old iron. "He was always going to do that," she said. "I think I knew it from the letter. 8 words don't leave you alone at a crossroads by accident. There was something he wanted more, and I was the placeholder until he found it." She paused. "The thing I keep coming back to is the letters. 6 months of letters, and he was considered in them, thoughtful. He asked about Rosie by name." She shook her head. "What kind of man does that?" "A man who wants to seem like a certain kind of man," Nathan said. "How do you know the difference?" "You watch what they do when something costs them." She turned and looked at him. He was watching the horizon, not her, his hands in his coat pockets, his breath making small clouds in the cold air. "Is that how you decide?" she asked. "It's the only thing that's ever been reliable," he said. She thought about that. She thought about what it meant and what it said about how he watched the world and how he'd arrived at this particular way of watching it. She thought about a brother who hadn't survived the first winter, and an empty chair at the table, and 7 years of a sad silence instead of a peaceful one. "Walter Whitmore," she said, "never once did anything that cost him." "No," Nathan agreed. "He never would." She nodded once. "I'm going to start dinner," she said. "Margaret." She stopped. "You weren't a placeholder," he said. "I want to say that plain because I think you need to hear it plain. Whatever he told himself, you weren't that. He just wasn't the right measure of what you were worth." She stood with her back to him and the cold sky over everything, and she did not trust herself to answer for a moment. "Thank you," she said finally. She went inside and started dinner, and Nathan went back to the barn, and Rosie looked up from her whale letters when the door opened and said, "Did you know that Moby Dick is described as having a white brow? I think that's like Dusk's nose." "Yes," Margaret said. "I think you're right." Christmas came quietly, which was the only way it could come on a ranch with one adult who didn't observe it, and 2 guests who had not planned for it. Rosie woke on Christmas morning and found on the table a small carved horse, dark wood with a white mark painted on its nose, roughly done but unmistakably Dusk. She held it for a long time without saying anything, which was unlike her, and when she looked up, Nathan was already outside doing the morning work as if nothing had happened. Rosie put the horse in her pocket and went out to help him. Margaret found the 2 of them at the paddock fence an hour later, Rosie explaining to Nathan in serious detail why she thought Dusk was lonely and needed a companion, and Nathan listening with full attention, nodding at the appropriate places, taking the horse's emotional needs as seriously as the proposition required. She watched them from across the yard and thought about things she did not try to put into words. January brought the hardest cold yet, the kind that settled in and declared residence. The work on the ranch contracted to its essential minimum. Keep the animals alive, keep the fire burning, keep the pipes from freezing. Nathan and Margaret moved through the days in the close, wordless efficiency of people who have learned each other's rhythms without discussing them, which is both more intimate and more complicated than people who discuss everything. There were harder moments. There always are. There was the evening Nathan came in from the barn short-tempered from a day of frozen water lines and things not working, and Margaret had reorganized the tool shelf because she'd needed to reach something and hadn't put things back in his order. And he said something about it in a tone that was sharper than the situation called for. He caught himself mid-sentence and stopped. "That came out wrong," he said. "It did," she said. "I'm sorry." She looked at him for a moment. "The lines that are frozen, can they be fixed tonight?" "No." "Then sit down and eat something and we'll talk about the shelf tomorrow when it's not an emergency." He looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the look of a man who is not used to being met on level ground and finds it both disorienting and something else, something he doesn't have immediate vocabulary for. He sat down. They didn't talk about the shelf the next day because by morning they both understood the shelf didn't matter. It was in the middle of January that the news about Walter Whitmore became something more than personal. Jim Caswell, who farmed a spread 10 miles east, came to the Colebrook ranch on a Wednesday afternoon looking for Nathan. His face had the particular set of a man who is carrying something heavy and hasn't decided yet whether he should have been the one to carry it. "It's the water," he said once he was inside and had Margaret's coffee in his hand. He looked at Nathan. "Whitmore's fencing." Nathan's face changed. Not a lot. But Margaret had been watching that face for 7 weeks, and she knew its geography well enough to see the small terrain shift around his eyes. "Where?" he said. "East Tributary, the one that runs down from the Garrett Ridge." Jim set down the coffee. "He's got men putting posts in. Says it's his land now with the Stokes purchase. Says the tributary runs through his property and he's got rights to it." "That tributary feeds 6 ranches," Nathan said. 7, Jim said, "counting yours." The room was quiet. Rosie had gone still in the corner where she was doing her letters, with the particular stillness of a child who understands that the conversation happening is not for her and who stays motionless in order to keep hearing it. "Has anyone talked to him?" Nathan said. "Tom Ridley went out there yesterday. Whitmore's man turned him around at the new fence line. Said Whitmore's not receiving visitors about the water matter." Jim's jaw was tight. "That's what he called it, the water matter." "Who holds the original deed lines for that tributary?" Margaret said. Both men looked at her. She looked back at them. "Someone surveyed this territory. Someone drew the original deed lines when the land was first filed. Those records exist somewhere. The land office in Laramie, or the territorial office in Cheyenne. If the tributary was originally classified as common access or as running through multiple properties, Whitmore's fence is illegal regardless of what the Stokes purchase says." Jim Caswell looked at Nathan. Nathan was looking at Margaret. "She's right," he said. "I know she's right," Jim said. "But getting those records means going to Laramie, and Laramie means the land office, and the land office means Gerald Fitch, who went to school with Whitmore's new father-in-law." "That's the territorial land office," Margaret said. "Cheyenne has the original survey records, and they're federal. Fitch doesn't touch those." Jim looked at her with the recalibrated expression of a man updating his understanding of who was in the room. "You know the land office system?" "I worked adjacent to it," she said. "The dress shop in town. Half my customers were land office wives. They talk, and I listen." There was a silence that was not uncomfortable, but was full. "Someone needs to go to Cheyenne," Nathan said. "I'll go," Margaret said. Both men looked at her again. "It's a 2-day ride," Nathan said. "I'm aware of what direction Cheyenne is." "I didn't mean—" "I know what you meant." She looked at him steadily. "You have 7 ranchers depending on that water, including yourself. You can't leave the place for 4 days in January. I can. I know what to ask for and who to ask. I'm not known in Cheyenne as anyone connected to the dispute." She paused. "And I have one other advantage." "What's that?" Jim said. "Nobody's going to expect a woman who was abandoned at a crossroads to be the one who goes to Cheyenne for the water records." Nathan's expression did something she couldn't fully read. Jim Caswell let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "She's got a point," he said. "She has several," Nathan said quietly. He wasn't happy about it. She could see that, Not because he didn't trust her, but because he'd spent 7 years being the one who handled things. And the relearning of that was a specific kind of discomfort that doesn't resolve quickly. But he also wasn't going to pretend her argument was wrong because it made him uncomfortable, which was, she was coming to understand, the most fundamental thing about him. He drove her to Laramie the next morning to catch the southbound stage. Rosie, after a negotiation that lasted through dinner and half of breakfast, remained at the ranch with the understanding that she was in charge of Dusk's morning feeding and that this was a serious responsibility. At the stage stop, Nathan stood beside the wagon while Margaret checked her bag. "The records you're looking for," he said. "Ask specifically for the original federal survey from 1876. That's when this district was first mapped. The tributary should be listed as a named water feature, which means it falls under territorial common use law." She looked up. "You know the survey year?" "My brother filed on this land in 1882. I read everything there was to read before we came out." She looked at him for a moment. This man who read everything before he committed to anything, who kept a brother's chair at his table, who had driven 3 miles through a storm to deliver a trunk she'd given away. "I'll be back in 4 days," she said. "I know." "Watch her with the fence line. She's been testing how far she can go before I notice." "I noticed," he said. She picked up her bag. "Margaret." She turned. He looked like he was going to say something and then didn't say it and then said a different thing. "Be careful." "Always," she said. She got on the stage. She did not look back, not because she didn't want to, but because she'd learned sometime in the last year that looking back was a luxury you couldn't afford until you were sure you had somewhere solid to look back from. Cheyenne was bigger than Laramie and colder in the specific way of a city in winter, where the cold got between buildings and concentrated. Margaret found a boarding house on the 2nd Street from the stage stop, paid for 2 nights, and presented herself at the Territorial Land Office at 8 the following morning. The man at the records desk was not Gerald Fitch. He was a young clerk with ink on his fingers who looked at her with the mild surprise of someone who had not expected his first visitor of the day to be a woman on federal business. She gave him the survey year. She gave him the district number, which she had gotten from Nathan's original deed that she'd taken from his file box while he was in the barn the night before. She told him she was requesting a copy of the tributary classification for the Eastern District water features under the 1876 survey. He went to find it. She waited. He came back 20 minutes later with a folder that he set on the counter and opened without any particular drama, the way clerks open folders when they do not yet know what is in them. What was in it was exactly what she needed. The east tributary of the Garrett Ridge was listed in the 1876 Federal Survey as a shared water feature, common access, serving 7 distinct land parcels. It had been classified as such because its source was on federal land above the ridge, which meant no single property owner could hold exclusive rights to it, regardless of what subsequent purchases changed about the surrounding land. Walter Whitmore's fence was not just morally wrong, it was federally illegal. Margaret read the relevant section 3 times to be certain she was reading it correctly. Then she asked the clerk for a certified copy, which cost 75 cents and required a supervisor's signature. And she waited for that too, in the particular patient way she had for waiting, still internally organized, spending the time going over what she needed to do next. The certified copy went into her bag, and her bag went with her back to the boarding house. And that night she sat on the edge of her rented bed and held the paper and thought about the series of things that had led her here. The letter she'd answered, the stage she'd boarded, the storm that had taken Abe Cutter's nerve and Walter Whitmore's wagon driver and put her in a stand of cottonwoods in Wyoming. She thought about all the ways it should have ended badly and hadn't, and she thought about the way things that look like closed doors sometimes turn out to be walls that don't actually reach the ceiling. She was back in Laramie in 3 days instead of 4 because the southbound stage ran late and the northbound made it up. Nathan was at the stage stop when she arrived, which she had not told him to be. She got off the stage and he was there. "You're early," she said. "Stage was on time." "You came yesterday too," she said. It was not a question. He didn't deny it. "Did you get it?" She took the certified copy from her bag and held it out. He read it standing in the road with the wind going past and his face doing the thing where nothing much showed on the surface and everything moved underneath. She had come to understand this was not concealment. It was the face of a man for whom feeling things was not a small experience, and who had learned over a long time to experience them in a place that wasn't visible to people who might take advantage. Common access, he said. Federal classification. His fence has been up for 3 weeks, which means he's been in violation for 3 weeks. The 7 affected ranchers file a joint complaint at the land office. Fitch doesn't get to touch it because it's federal jurisdiction. Whitmore has to take the fence down or face federal enforcement. Nathan looked at her. He's going to fight it, he said. He can fight it all he wants, she said. The 1876 survey is not a document he can charm. Something shifted in Nathan Colebrook's face then. Not the small terrain movements she'd been cataloging for 2 months, but something larger, something that moved through the whole of his expression, the way weather moves across open land, wide and real, and not pretending to be anything other than what it was. Come on, he said. Rosie has been asking where you were every 4 hours on the dot since you left. Has she been testing the fence line? Extensively, he said. They walked to the wagon, and he took her bag and she let him, and the space between them on the wagon bench on the drive back to the ranch was different from every space that had come before it. Not smaller exactly, but less empty, filled with something that neither of them had named yet, and both of them knew was there. The way you know a storm is coming before the first cloud appears, from something in the air, some shift in the pressure of things, some quality of the light that tells you the world is about to change. And this time, it might change towards something worth having. The certified copy of the 1876 Federal Survey changed things, but it did not change them quickly, because nothing that involved Walter Whitmore and a man named Stokes with money behind him changed quickly. That was the first lesson Margaret learned about frontier justice. It moved, but it moved at the pace of people who had learned that patience was a weapon and who had no particular urgency about other people's water. Nathan rode out to Jim Caswell the morning after Margaret returned from Cheyenne, then to Tom Ridley, then to the 4 other ranchers whose land the east tributary touched. He did this in one long day, starting before light and coming back after dark with mud on the horse, and a look on his face that told Margaret the conversations had gone the way necessary conversations go when people are scared, some willing, some resistant, all of them calculating what it would cost them. Ridley's in, he said, sitting down at the table with his coat still on. Caswell, the Brennan brothers. Hollis Pratt needs more time. Pratt's the one whose eastern fence line runs closest to Whitmore's new boundary, Margaret said. She'd been listening at dinner for 2 months and had a map in her head of who owned what and why it mattered. He's worried about retaliation. He should be, Nathan said. Whitmore is going to make an example of someone when this complaint gets filed. Pratt's the most exposed. Then Pratt shouldn't be the one to sign the complaint first. She set a plate down in front of him. Put him in the middle of the names. Let Caswell and Ridley carry the front. Nathan looked at the plate, then at her. You've been thinking about this. I've been thinking about it since Cheyenne, she said. Eat. It's cold. He ate. Rosie appeared from the back room in her socks, assessed the situation, and sat down at the other end of the table with the carved horse Nathan had made her, walking it across the table surface with the private narration of a child whose imagination required no audience. Is the water going to be all right? She asked, without looking up from the horse. Nathan and Margaret looked at each other. We're working on it, Margaret said. Rosie walked the horse to the edge of the table and back. That's what people say when they don't want to answer, she said. I just want to know if the animals are going to be okay. The animals are going to be okay, Nathan said. Rosie looked at him, evaluating whether this was the real answer or the polite version. Okay, she said, and went back to the horse. The joint complaint was filed at the federal land office in Cheyenne 3 weeks later, signed by 6 ranchers, referencing the 1876 survey classification and requesting immediate enforcement review of the fence installation on the east tributary of the Garrett Ridge. Margaret had written the complaint. She'd done it at the kitchen table over 3 evenings, with Nathan reading each draft and marking the places where the language needed to be more precise or less personal, and with Rosie asleep in the back room and the wood stove going, and the 2 of them working across a table covered in documents in a silence that was entirely the comfortable kind. She was good at this. She hadn't known it before because she'd never had occasion to do it. To take a complicated situation and reduce it to its essential documented facts in language that could not be argued with, that was specific and traceable and correct. Nathan told her this on the third evening, plainly, without ceremony. "You're good at this," he said. "I'm good at several things," she said. "It took me longer than it should have to find out what they were." "That happens to most people." "It happens more to women," she said, "because the things we're told we're good at are usually the things that are useful to someone else." He thought about this for a moment. "Yes," he said. "I think that's right." February came in hard and stayed hard. The complaint was logged in Cheyenne and a federal review was initiated, which meant that Whitmore's fence was technically under scrutiny but technically still standing while the process moved at its federally mandated pace. Nathan had told the other ranchers to say nothing publicly, to make no moves on the fence, to let the paper do the work. This was difficult advice for men who were watching their animals drink from increasingly shallow water as Whitmore's fence redirected flow, but it was correct advice, and most of them followed it. Whitmore knew about the complaint by the end of the first week. In a territory this size, with this few people, nothing stayed private. He came to the Colebrook Ranch on a Thursday. Margaret was in the barn when his horse came into the yard. She heard it from inside. A single horse, moving at a canter and pulling up short. The particular sound of someone arriving with intention. She looked through the barn door and saw him dismount. She had never seen Walter Whitmore in person. He was not what she'd imagined from the letters, which was its own kind of information. She'd imagined someone careful-looking, considered, a man whose face matched his handwriting. What she saw instead was a man of average height who moved like someone accustomed to having space made for him, not large but certain, with the physical confidence of a person who has rarely encountered a room that didn't accommodate him. He knocked at the cabin door. Nathan opened it. She could not hear the conversation from the barn. She stayed where she was. She did not go to the cabin door, not because she was afraid, but because she was calculating, and what she calculated was that Walter Whitmore had come here expecting either Margaret or Nathan, and finding both would hand him nothing, and finding Nathan alone would hand him nothing, and her appearing in the yard while he was at the door would hand him the satisfaction of seeing the effect he'd had, which was the one thing she was not going to give him. Rosie appeared beside her. "Is that him?" Rosie asked, in a voice designed to be very quiet, which meant she'd been watching from the cabin window and had come out the back. "Yes," Margaret said. Rosie studied him through the barn door with the serious, cataloging attention she gave to things that required assessment. "He looks like he thinks he's taller than he is," she said. Margaret looked at her daughter. "That's the most precise thing I've ever heard," she said. They waited. The conversation at the cabin door lasted perhaps 8 minutes. Then Whitmore went back to his horse, mounted without looking toward the barn, and rode out the way he'd come. Nathan came to the barn. "He wants to settle," he said. "Of course he does," Margaret said. "The federal review means he can't sell the Stokes land as water sovereign until it's resolved, and he needs to sell it to finance whatever he's building next." He offered $300 to each of the 6 ranchers to drop the complaint. The barn was quiet, except for the horses moving in their stalls. "That's money," Nathan said. "It's not the water," Margaret said. "No. $300 disappears, the water doesn't. Not unless he fences it again the moment the complaint is dropped. And then what do 6 ranchers do, file again? He'll just buy more time and then outmaneuver on the next technicality." Nathan looked at her. "I know that," he said. "Then why are you telling me his offer?" "Because I wanted to hear you say it out loud," he said, "so I know I'm not the only one who's certain." She looked at him for a moment. "You're not," she said. He nodded. "I'll tell the others." Not everyone agreed with her. Hollis Pratt took the $300. He came to Nathan's ranch on a Sunday to tell him in person, with the specific shame of a man who has done the rational thing and knows it was still a betrayal. Nathan took it without anger, which Margaret thought was harder than being angry would have been. "He's got 4 children," Nathan said afterward, "and his herd is down from last year. $300 is real money when you're that close to the line." "I know," she said. "I'm not angry at him." "I know that too," she said. "That's why it's harder than being angry would be."
He looked at her with that expression again, the one she'd cataloged as the look of a man finding level ground unexpectedly. 5 complainants instead of 6 was not fatal to the case, but it was a wound, and Whitmore's lawyer in Cheyenne knew it. The lawyer's name was Beaumont, and he was skilled in the specific way that lawyers hired by men with money were skilled, not in finding the truth, but in making the truth take longer than the other side could afford to wait. Beaumont's response to the federal complaint argued that the 1876 survey classification was based on land conditions that had materially changed with the Stokes purchase and the subsequent property consolidation, and requested a new survey assessment before any enforcement action could be taken. A new survey assessment in federal land bureaucracy meant months, possibly a year. Margaret read the response at the kitchen table on a Wednesday morning while Nathan was outside and Rosie was doing her letters. She read it twice. Then she read it a third time, specifically the section about changed land conditions, and she felt something click in her mind the way a door latch clicks when it finds the slot it was made for. "Rosie," she said, "get your coat." Rosie looked up from her letters. "Where are we going?" "To find Jim Caswell." "Why?" "Because he's been farming east of that ridge for 9 years and he keeps records," Margaret said. "Farmers always keep records if they're good farmers. And Jim Caswell is a good farmer." Rosie got her coat. Jim Caswell did keep records. He kept them in a tin box under his bed, written in a cramped hand in a series of ledgers that went back to his first year on the property. Water levels, seasonal flow measurements, crop yields in relation to water availability. 9 years of documented water behavior on the East Tributary, including 3 particularly dry years in which the common access flow had been what kept his animals alive. Margaret sat at Jim Caswell's kitchen table for 2 hours and took notes. Then she asked Jim a series of questions about what he knew of the other ranchers' records, and Jim confirmed that Tom Ridley kept similar books, and that the Brennan brothers' father had kept records before them that the brothers had inherited along with the land. "This doesn't show changed land conditions," she told Nathan that evening. "This shows 9 years of consistent water behavior that matches the 1876 classification exactly. Beaumont's argument is that conditions changed with the Stokes purchase. These records show the conditions didn't change, only the ownership around them did." Nathan read her notes. He read them slowly, the way he read everything, completely, without rushing, which she had initially found unusual in a rancher, and had come to understand was simply how he processed things that mattered. "This needs to go to Cheyenne with an addendum to the complaint," he said. "I know. I'll go next week." "Not alone this time." She looked at him. "I'll ride with you," he said. It was not negotiable in the way he said it, not because he didn't think she was capable, but because there was something else in his voice, something that had moved closer to the surface in the last several weeks. "Caswell can watch the place for 4 days." "And Rosie?" she said. "Rosie comes," he said. "She's been asking about Cheyenne for a month." "You've been talking to her about Cheyenne?" "She asked if there were bigger horses there," he said. "I told her it was possible. She made me describe the city. I had to admit I'd only been twice." Margaret looked at this man, this rancher who had read everything before he committed, who listened to a 5-year-old's horse concerns with complete seriousness, who kept a spare chair for a brother 7 years gone, who had said, "I'm not suggesting it as charity," and meant it so completely that it had taken her 2 months to understand what he had meant instead. And she felt something that she had not let herself feel since Philadelphia, since before Philadelphia, since the last time she'd believed the ground under her was solid. It frightened her. She let it. They went to Cheyenne in the 3rd week of February, the 3 of them in Nathan's wagon, which was not a comfortable vehicle for 4 days of winter travel, and which Rosie described as very honest about what it is, which Nathan said was the kindest review anyone had given it. The road south was better than Margaret expected, and worse than Nathan had hoped, and they stopped the first night at a way station that had a fireplace and a proprietor who gave Rosie a piece of hard candy without being asked, which Rosie accepted with the gravity of someone receiving a significant gift, and then spent 15 minutes deciding whether to eat it. They drove the second day in weather that was cold but clear, and Rosie sat between them on the bench and cataloged everything she saw. The specific quality of the light on flat snow, the way certain trees grew in clusters where water ran underground, the distant shapes of other homesteads marking the land in the particular pattern of human stubbornness in difficult country.
Why do people come here? She asked at one point. Not to anyone in particular. Different reasons, Nathan said. What was yours? My brother wanted to, he said. And you came with him? Yes. Rosie thought about this. That's a good reason, she decided. Coming because someone you love is going. Nathan looked at the road. Yes, he said. It is. Margaret felt the weight of that exchange settle somewhere in her chest and did not look at either of them for a moment. Cheyenne received them the way cities in winter receive travelers, functionally, without warmth, with the specific transactional efficiency of a place that has people coming and going constantly and has learned not to invest in any particular arrival. They found a boarding house, got Rosie settled with the carved horse and a blanket and a sternly worded agreement about not leaving the room without telling someone, and went to the federal land office the following morning. The addendum took 3 hours to file properly. The records clerk was not the young man with ink on his fingers from Margaret's first visit, but an older woman with reading spectacles and a manner that suggested she had processed a great many claims from a great many people and had developed an excellent system for telling which ones had merit. She read the addendum. She read the attached record summaries. She read the original complaint. This is well organized, she said, not looking up. Thank you, Margaret said. Most complaints from range disputes come in as grievances, the woman said. Emotional, full of what someone deserves. This reads like documentation. It is documentation, Margaret said. The woman looked at her over the spectacles. Who prepared it? I did, Margaret said. The woman held her gaze for a moment, then she looked at Nathan. You're the primary complainant, she said. I am, Nathan said. And she is? Nathan looked at Margaret. Something moved in his face. Not complicated, actually. Simple. Clear. The face of a man who has made a decision and is not confused about it. She's my partner, he said. The words sat in the office air between the four of them. Nathan, Margaret, the clerk, and the particular silence of a place that processes legal documents and therefore understands what words carry weight. Margaret did not look at Nathan. The addendum will be logged today, the clerk said, returning to the papers. The review board will have the full record within 10 days. Given the strength of the historical documentation, I would expect a preliminary finding before the end of March. They came out of the federal land office into the February cold of Cheyenne, and they stood on the steps for a moment, and then they walked back toward the boarding house, and for half a block neither of them said anything. Partner, Margaret said. It was the accurate word, Nathan said. Was it? You prepared the complaint. You found the survey. You identified the record strategy. You wrote the addendum. He kept walking. What would you call it? She kept walking too. I'd call it exactly what you called it, she said quietly. He nodded once. They walked the rest of the way in the comfortable silence, the kind that isn't empty and doesn't need filling, the kind that two people can only walk in together when they've already been through something real. That evening, with Rosie asleep, Nathan sat at the small table in the boarding house room with a cup of coffee going cold, and Margaret sat across from him, and the lamp was low, and outside Cheyenne moved in its city way, people and horses, and the sound of a place that didn't sleep the way the open country did. When this is resolved, Nathan said. He stopped. When it's resolved, Margaret said, I want to say something that I'm not sure how to say in a way that doesn't... He stopped again. He was not a man who stopped often, and watching him stop was watching something that cost him. I've been alone a long time, he said finally. Long enough that I stopped thinking it was temporary. I thought it was just what my life was. And then you and Rosie were in those cottonwoods, and I... He turned the coffee cup in his hands. I don't know what I'm saying. Yes, you do, she said. He looked at her. You're saying the sad silence is different from the peaceful one, she said, and you're asking if I know the difference. He was quiet for a moment. Do you? He said. She held his gaze. She thought about 8 words on wet paper. She thought about the morning she'd built his fire from coals before he came in. Not because it was her obligation, but because she'd wanted to. Because there was a particular satisfaction in doing something useful for a person who had done something real for you, and how that satisfaction had quietly deepened over 4 months into something that was not gratitude anymore. "I know the difference," she said. "I've known it for a while." He nodded. He looked at the coffee cup. He looked at her. "I'm not easy," he said. "I know that about myself." "I'm not easy either," she said. "I think we've both noticed that about each other." "Yes," he said. "I think we have." The lamp guttered slightly in a draft from the window. Outside, Cheyenne kept moving. In the next room, Rosie slept with the carved horse in her hand, as she had slept every night since Christmas, her breathing steady and complete, the breathing of a child who has decided it's safe enough to sleep deeply. Nothing was resolved that night. Nothing was declared or promised or sealed with any formality. They were two people sitting across a table in a cold room in a city that didn't know them, and they had both said true things in careful language, and the true things had been heard, and that was enough for now. More than enough, more than either of them had had in longer than they wanted to calculate. The road back to the ranch took 2 days, and they traveled it the way they had come. The three of them on the bench, Rosie in the middle, the country opening up around them as they went north, wider and colder, and more itself. On the afternoon of the second day, with the ranch just visible in the distance, Rosie looked out at the land and said, without preamble, "I think this is home now." Neither adult responded immediately. "Is that okay?" Rosie asked. Not to her mother specifically, to both of them. Nathan looked at the horizon. "Yes," he said. "That's okay." Rosie nodded, satisfied, and went back to watching the land go by. Already done with the question because she'd gotten the answer she needed, the way she always was. Precise in what she asked for, done with it once she had it, moving on to the next true thing. Margaret kept her eyes on the road ahead. She did not cry. She was not a woman who cried easily, and she was not going to start in a moving wagon in February. But she felt something give way in her chest, the final resistance of a woman who had been braced against the world for so long that she'd started to believe the bracing was the same thing as being strong. And she understood now, with the cold air on her face and her daughter's warm weight beside her and the ranch coming closer in the winter light, that they were not the same thing at all. That what she'd been doing was surviving, and what she was doing now was something else, something that had a different name and a different weight, and required a different kind of courage than any she'd had to use before. The horses knew the way home and needed no guidance on the final stretch. Nathan let them have their heads, and they moved along the familiar road with the particular purposeful ease of animals going somewhere they recognized. And the ranch came up around them like it had always been there, which it had, waiting, in the specific patient way that solid things wait, for the people who belonged in them to finally arrive. The federal preliminary finding came on the 22nd of March, which was a Thursday, which was also the day Nathan pulled his back hauling a split log off the woodpile and spent the next 4 days unable to stand fully upright without his face doing something he would not have wanted witnessed. The finding arrived by courier from Cheyenne, a single folded document with a federal seal that Margaret opened at the kitchen table while Nathan sat sideways in his chair because it was the only position that didn't make him grimace. The language was formal and dense and took 3 paragraphs to say what could have been said in 2 sentences, which was, the 1876 classification held, the historical usage records substantiated consistent common access, and the fence installation was found to be in violation of federal territorial water law. Whitmore had 30 days to remove the fence or face enforcement action, which in federal terms meant a marshal and a court order and the kind of official attention that men with social ambitions and new in-laws with land investments found extremely inconvenient. Margaret read the relevant section aloud. Nathan listened with his elbow on the table and his coffee in his hand and his back doing whatever it was doing. 30 days, he said. 28 now, she said. It was dated 2 days ago. He'll move it in 10, Nathan said. He doesn't want the marshal, not with the Stokes family watching. No, she said. He doesn't. She folded the document and set it on the table between them, and they both looked at it for a moment. The way you look at something you've been working toward for a long time. Not with triumph exactly, because triumph implies it was ever in doubt, and they'd both believed in the documents too completely for real doubt to take hold, but with a quiet satisfaction that was its own thing, particular and earned. You should ride to Caswell today, she said. I should ride to Caswell today, he agreed, and made an attempt to stand up that did not go well. Or, she said, I'll ride to Caswell today. He looked at her. You can tell me which horse, she said. I know the road. He was quiet for a moment, with the particular quiet of a man evaluating whether his pride is worth more than his back, which was a calculation he was getting better at since February. Take the bay, he said. She goes easy on soft ground, and the north road'll still be wet. Margaret rode to Jim Caswell's with the document in her coat pocket and came back 3 hours later with Caswell's handshake still warm on her palm and the news that he'd already sent his boy to tell the Brennan brothers. Tom Ridley had seen the courier pass through toward the Colebrook ranch that morning and had ridden over to Caswell's himself, so the word was moving without needing much help from anyone. Rosie was in the yard when Margaret came back, ostensibly sweeping the area near the paddock fence, actually conducting a prolonged conversation with Dusk through the rails. She was 6 now, had been for 3 weeks, and the additional year had not changed her fundamental nature, but had given her more vocabulary for it, which made her simultaneously easier and harder to live with. Did it work? Rosie asked, looking up from Dusk. It worked, Margaret said. Rosie nodded with the satisfaction of someone who had expected this outcome and was pleased to have been right. Good, she said, and went back to Dusk. Margaret stood in the yard for a moment with the horse blowing warm air against her neck and the March light coming down thin and real across the land, and she felt the specific weight of what they'd done. Not her alone, not Nathan alone, but the thing they'd done together, the complaint and the addendum and the records, and the 4 days in Cheyenne and the patience while the federal machinery moved at its federally mandated pace. 7 ranchers, 6 after Pratt, had held their fence lines and their water with nothing but paper and time, and the paper and time had been enough, which was not always the case out here, and which she understood was something to hold on to. Nathan was on his feet by the end of the week, still careful but functional, moving around the ranch with the slightly adjusted gait of a man renegotiating with his body's limits, which he did without complaint and without asking for adjustment in anyone else's expectations, which was both admirable and occasionally maddening. Whitmore's fence came down in 9 days, not 30, not 28, 9. Nathan heard about it from Dolph Garrett, who heard about it from the man who drove the supply wagon for the Stokes operation, and who had watched Whitmore's hired hands pull posts in the cold with expressions suggesting they'd been given very little notice. Dolph delivered this information to the Colebrook Ranch on a Tuesday with the poorly concealed satisfaction of a man who has been waiting to be the bearer of good news for a while. Posts are out, he said, all of them. Tributaries running free again. He looked between Nathan and Margaret with the expression of someone assembling a story he'd be telling for years. Heard Whitmore told his men the fence was always temporary, a survey error, said he'd planned to take it down once things were clarified. Of course he did, Margaret said. Of course he did, Dolph agreed happily. Nathan said nothing. He was looking at the middle distance in the way he did when something had resolved and he was accounting for it internally, making sure all the pieces had landed where he thought they had. Water's running to all 7 properties, he said finally. All 7, Dolph said. Pratt's included, not that he deserves it. He deserves it, Nathan said. He's got 4 children, and he was scared. That's not the same as being wrong. Dolph looked at him, looked at Margaret. You know, he said, when she first came to the ranch, people in town had opinions. I know what opinions they had, Margaret said. They were wrong, Dolph said simply. I want to say that plain because I should have said it sooner. Margaret looked at him. Dolph Garrett was not a complicated man and not a nuanced one, but he was a man who could identify when he'd been wrong and say so, which put him ahead of a considerable portion of the human population. Thank you, Dolph, she said. He nodded, finished his coffee, and left, and the ranch was quiet again, and Nathan looked at Margaret with the gray sky eyes and said, April. She looked at him. April what? I want to get married in April, he said. If you're willing, before the planning work gets heavy. She stared at him. That is possibly the least romantic proposal in the history of the Wyoming territory, she said. I know, he said. I've been trying to find a better one for 6 weeks and I don't have it. He met her gaze and held it. I know what I'm asking, and I know what I'm offering, and I know I'm not easy to live with. I already told you that. And you've been here 4 months and you know it's true in ways you probably didn't anticipate. The tool shelf, she said, among other things. You also woke me up at 5 in the morning in January to show me what the frost looked like on the east field because you said it was something I should see. He stopped. That's true. It was beautiful, she said. I didn't tell you that. He looked at her. It was the most beautiful thing I'd seen in a long time, she said. A man knocking on my door at 5 in the morning because he thought there was something worth seeing and he wanted someone else to see it with him. She held his gaze. That's the proposal, Nathan. Not April and not the planting schedule. That's it. He was quiet. Yes, she said. I'll marry you in April. Something moved across his face. The wide weather movement she'd cataloged once in Cheyenne and had been waiting to see again, the one that wasn't small and wasn't controlled, and was simply him, the actual man underneath the rancher's discipline and the 7 years of practiced solitude. April, he said. Before the planting gets heavy, she agreed. They told Rosie that evening. Rosie listened to the full explanation, which Margaret delivered clearly and without softening it into euphemism, because Rosie didn't operate well with euphemism and never had. And then she sat for a moment with her hands in her lap and the carved horse on the table in front of her. So Nathan would be my father, she said. He would be your stepfather, Margaret said carefully. My father was someone I didn't know well, Rosie said, with the specific factual neutrality of a child who has processed something sad and come out the other side of it. Nathan is someone I know. She looked at Nathan. Do you want to be? The question was direct in the way all of Rosie's questions were direct. Not challenging, but genuinely inquiring, requiring a genuine answer. Nathan sat forward in his chair with his elbows on his knees, which put him closer to her level. Yes, he said, I want to be. Rosie picked up the carved horse and looked at it. Okay, she said. Then okay. She went back to her letters, and Nathan and Margaret looked at each other over the top of her head. And there was nothing to say that needed saying because everything that needed to be understood was already understood. They were married on the 12th of April by a justice of the peace from Laramie named Howard Beale, who drove out to the ranch on a Saturday morning and performed the ceremony in the yard because the cabin was too small and the day was clear enough to be outside. June Harlow came, Jim Caswell and his wife came. Tom Ridley came. The Brennan brothers came, which surprised Margaret because she'd spoken to them only twice, but Nathan said they would, and he was right. Rosie stood beside Margaret in the blue wool dress that had been too short by December and had been let down twice since, and was now the right length again, and she held the carved horse in both hands and watched the proceedings with the grave attention she gave to things that were significant, which this was. It was not a long ceremony. Howard Beale was a man who understood that the meaning was not in the length of the words, but in whether the people saying them meant them. And Nathan and Margaret both meant them in the particular way of people who have already lived the reality of what they're promising and are now simply making it official. When it was done, June Harlow hugged Margaret with real warmth and said, I knew from the first week you weren't going to leave. And Margaret said, I didn't know that. And June said, I know. That's how I knew. Jim Caswell shook Nathan's hand and then, unexpectedly, shook Margaret's, which was not what men typically did at weddings in Wyoming in 1890, but which Jim apparently felt was the appropriate gesture given the circumstances. Rosie ate 3 pieces of the cake that Nathan's neighbor, Mrs. Pratt, had brought, Hollis Pratt's wife, who had appeared that morning with a cake tin and an expression that was both apologetic on her husband's behalf and firm about not dwelling on it, and then fell asleep in the barn next to Dusk's stall while the adults were still talking, and was carried to bed by Nathan without waking, which was the deepest kind of trust there is. Spring came in earnest after the wedding, the way Wyoming spring comes. Not gradually, but in surges, warm days followed by cold ones. The ground releasing water upward as the frost let go, the first green things appearing in the places that had been bare for 5 months. There was a great deal of work, as Nathan had said there would be. More than Margaret had anticipated, even knowing it was coming, the specific accumulated labor of a ranch waking up from winter with its needs running ahead of the hands available to meet them. She worked. This is not a poetic statement. She worked the way the land required, physically and daily, and without the option of deciding she didn't feel like it today. She planted the kitchen garden in the second week of April, and the main crop rose in the third. She managed the animals through the difficult transition weeks when the cold still came back at night and the young ones needed watching. She kept the books. Nathan's accounting system had been a functional disaster. Numbers kept in 2 different ledgers with no consistent method, and several years of tax records that were accurate in content and catastrophic in organization, and reorganized them into something that could be presented to anyone who needed to see them. Nathan watched her do all of this without comment, which was his way of respecting it. He did not narrate her competence or congratulate her for it, which some men did in a way that was really just expressing their own surprise. He simply adjusted his understanding of what the ranch could accomplish with 2 capable people working it and started making plans accordingly. In May, he proposed expanding the herd by 12 head, which required a trip to the cattle market in Rawlins. Margaret went with him because she had read enough of his previous purchasing records to have opinions about price points, which she shared, and because she was now legally his partner in the property and the decisions in it, which the deed transfer they'd filed in Laramie the week after the wedding made official. The cattle dealer in Rawlins, a man named Corcoran with a weathered face and a shrewd manner, directed his conversation entirely at Nathan for the first 40 minutes, which was normal. Then Margaret pointed out a problem with 3 of the animals he was proposing at his second-tier price, a subtle favoring on 1 and 2 with early signs of respiratory trouble that Corcoran had either not noticed or had noticed and was hoping they hadn't. And the conversation shifted. Corcoran looked at her with recalibrated interest. "Your wife," he said to Nathan. "My wife," Nathan said. "She know cattle." "She knows what she's looking at," Nathan said. "Same as anyone who pays attention." Corcoran looked at Margaret. Margaret looked at the 12 head they actually wanted at the price they actually intended to pay. They got 11 of them at that price, and the 12th at a discount for the favoring, which a week of rest and a different feed ratio corrected completely. Nathan told her on his way home that the discount on the 12th alone had covered the cost of the trip. "I know," she said. "That's why I mentioned the favoring first." He looked at her with the expression she'd come to think of as his full attention face, the one that was quiet on the surface and completely present underneath. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. I'm glad you're here." It was not an eloquent statement. It was not designed to be. It was Nathan Colebrook telling the truth in the only register he had, which was direct and plain and meant exactly what it said. "I'm glad too," she said. Summer brought work and heat, and Rosie turning 6.5 and developing opinions about the garden that were both helpful and occasionally at odds with Margaret's, which was fine because Rosie's opinions were usually based on observation and usually worth considering. She had a particular affinity for the things that grew close to the ground, the vegetables, the herbs Margaret had planted along the south wall of the cabin, the wild plants she cataloged in a small book she'd started keeping, asking Nathan to write the names because her own writing was still developing. Nathan had become, without either of them planning it, Rosie's primary teacher in things that required the outdoors: the horses, the land reading, the weather signs, the fence work, the names of plants and birds, and the behavior of animals in different conditions. He taught these things the way he taught everything, completely, without simplification, with the underlying assumption that Rosie was capable of understanding anything if it was explained accurately, which she was. Margaret taught her everything else: reading, which Rosie was attacking with an appetite that had already gotten her through the less boring sections of the whale book and had moved on to the agricultural manual, which she found more interesting than Margaret expected. Numbers, which Rosie found easier than reading and approached with the same systematic precision she applied to everything. History, such as Margaret knew it, delivered conversationally over the kitchen garden and the mending basket and the long process of butter making that Rosie had decided was her domain and defended accordingly. It was in July, on a Sunday when the heat was sitting heavy on the land and the work had paused for the afternoon, that Margaret found Nathan at the paddock fence watching Rosie ride dusk. She had been riding for 2 months. Nathan had started her on the leading rein and moved to supervise solo riding in 4 weeks, which was faster than he'd planned and exactly as fast as Rosie's competence had required. She was small on the horse, but not tentative. She sat with the particular uprightness of a child who has been told once how to sit and has decided that is how sitting should be done. Margaret stood beside Nathan at the fence. "She's good," he said. "She's you," Margaret said. "She pays attention to what things actually are instead of what she wants them to be." Nathan was quiet for a moment. Then, "My brother was like that." She looked at him. "Daniel," he said. It was the first time he'd used the name. He saw things straight. He didn't have any of the wishful part that makes people see what they want instead of what's there. He watched Rosie take Dusk around the near end of the paddock, the horse responsive and easy under her small hands. "I used to think it was a sad way to be. Now I think it's the only way to survive anything real." Margaret looked at the side of his face, the particular line of his jaw that she knew now as well as anything in her daily life, the slight creasing at the corner of his eye from years of squinting at a bright sky. "He would have liked her," she said. "Yes," Nathan said. "He would have." "He would have liked you too," she said. "What you've built here, what you kept going." He looked at her. "You think so?" "You stayed," she said. "After he was gone, with every reason to leave, you stayed and you kept the land and you kept the ranch. 7 years. She held his gaze. "That's not stubbornness, that's loyalty. To him and to what he wanted to build. He would have recognized it." Nathan turned back to the paddock. "I hope so," he said quietly. It was the most she'd ever heard him say about Daniel, and she did not push for more, because she understood by now that the most important things Nathan Colebrook said were said once, exactly, and didn't require elaboration. The summer moved through its work and its weather and its daily accumulation of things that were small individually and together constituted a life. Margaret repaired the east fence line with Nathan over 3 days in August that were brutally hot and which produced a kind of exhausted camaraderie she'd never experienced before. The specific solidarity of two people doing hard physical work together in bad conditions, not romanticized, not performed, just real. They fought once on the second day about the post spacing, which Nathan was doing by eye, and Margaret thought should be measured, and they were both partially right and figured this out by the end of the day without either of them having to fully concede, which was a better resolution than most arguments got. In September, a letter arrived from Cheyenne. Not from the federal office, from a law firm representing the Stokes estate. Margaret opened it while Nathan was out and read it standing at the table, and then she sat down. The letter informed her, or rather, informed Nathan Colebrook, as the named complainant, though Margaret had filed the addendum, that Walter Whitmore and the Stokes family were initiating a civil lawsuit against the 6 ranchers who had signed the federal complaint, alleging damages to the Stokes property investment as a result of what their legal representation described as a coordinated campaign to misuse the federal review process for competitive commercial advantage. She read it twice. Then she thought about Beaumont, the Stokes family lawyer, and about the way men with money operated when they lost the first round. Not by accepting the loss, but by changing the game, moving the fight to a venue where money mattered more than documents, where the cost of defending yourself could become its own kind of defeat, even when you were right. This was that. She sat at the table for a long time. When Nathan came in, she handed him the letter without preamble. He read it. He set it down. "He can't win this," Nathan said. "I know he can't win this," Margaret said. "That's not the point. The point is the cost of proving he can't win it." He looked at her. "A civil suit means lawyers," she said. 6 ranchers paying lawyers. Months, maybe a year of proceedings. Whitmore and Stokes have deep pockets. Caswell doesn't. Ridley is barely ahead of his debts from last winter. Pratt, she stopped. "This is designed to cost us more than we can pay even when we win." Nathan picked up the letter and read it again. She watched him read it. The slowness, the completeness, the way he was not reacting, but processing. "We need someone who knows civil law," he said. "We need someone who knows civil law and will work on contingency or deferred payment," she said. "And we need to get to the other 5 ranchers before Whitmore's people do, Because if any one of them settles separately, the unified defense falls apart. Caswell first, Nathan said. Tonight? She said. They rode to Caswell's that evening, the two of them, leaving Rosie in the care of Mrs. Pratt, who had by now become a reliable fixture in their lives. Not a close friend exactly, more the kind of neighbor who shows up when something needs doing and doesn't need to be asked twice. Caswell read the letter with his wife beside him and his oldest son standing in the doorway, and his face went through the sequence that Margaret expected. Shock, then anger, then the cold calculation of a man counting what he had against what he was about to need. He can't win, Caswell said. He doesn't need to win, Margaret said. He needs you to spend. Caswell looked at his wife. His wife looked at the letter, then she looked at Margaret. What do we do? She said. You don't settle, Margaret said. None of you settle, no matter what he offers, because the moment one person settles, the others lose the unified defense, and he picks you off one at a time. She looked at Caswell. And we find a lawyer who understands what this suit actually is, which is harassment with legal language on it, and who can argue it as such to a territorial judge. You know a lawyer like that? Caswell said. She thought about June Harlow's customers, about the conversations she'd listened to over seams and fittings for 6 months, the wives of Laramie men talking about other Laramie men, which was how she'd known about Gerald Fitch and the Federal Land Office. I know who to ask, she said. The lawyer's name was Elias Drummond, and he had an office above the hardware store in Laramie and a reputation built on a decade of taking cases that other lawyers declined because they were complicated or underpaid or both. June had mentioned him twice in passing, once in relation to a property dispute he'd resolved for a widow on the North Road, once in relation to a contract case he'd won against a mining company that had 17 lawyers to his one. Margaret went to see him the following Monday. His office was exactly as advertised, small, dense with paper, smelling of coffee and old documents, with a man at the desk who looked up when she came in with the specific focus of someone who spends his days reading small print and has learned to extract information quickly from whatever appears in front of him. She gave him the letter. She gave him the original federal finding. She gave him the complaint and the addendum. She gave him the survey record summary. He read all of it. He was a fast reader. 6 defendants, he said, potentially 5 if Pratt settles. He shouldn't settle. I know, I've told him. His wife understands the argument better than he does, and she's working on him. She paused. What are we looking at? Drummond set down the papers and looked at her over them. You prepared this addendum. Yes. And the original complaint language? Yes. He nodded slowly. The suit is frivolous on its face, he said. A federal finding of violation doesn't create civil liability for the complainants. What they're alleging, coordinated misuse of the review process, requires them to prove malicious intent, which they can't prove because there was no malicious intent. There was a legitimate federal complaint with documented evidence. He paused. However, frivolous suits cost money to defeat regardless of their merit, which you clearly already understand. I understand it's designed to outlast us, she said. What I need to know is whether it can be ended faster than that. A motion to dismiss, Drummond said. Filed early, before discovery costs run up. Arguing the suit fails to state a legal claim because federal findings of violation are not grounds for civil liability to the complainants. If the judge agrees, it ends before it begins. And if the judge doesn't agree, then we're in for a longer road. He looked at her steadily. But the motion has merit, strong merit. He named his fee, which was not small and was not, given the alternative, not worth it. She told him she'd have an answer by Friday. She went back to the ranch and sat down with Nathan and the ledger, and they went through the numbers together, which was not a pleasant process, but was a necessary one. The way all real decisions require you to look at the actual shape of your resources instead of the shape you wish they had. They could cover Drummond's retainer. Barely. It would mean delaying the purchase of 2 more head they'd planned for fall and cutting back on winter stores they'd been planning to expand. It's worth it, Nathan said. Yes, she said. You're sure about Drummond? I'm sure he's right about the law, she said. Whether the judge sees it the way he does? That I can't know. Nathan looked at the ledger. What's your read on it? Not the law, your read. She thought about Walter Whitmore's letter, the careful handwriting that looked like consideration and wasn't. She thought about the fence posts going in on the east tributary while 6 families' water tables dropped. She thought about Beaumont's counterfiling and the civil suit and the escalating responses of a man who had never once done a thing that cost him, and was now discovering that some things had to be paid for regardless. "He's scared," she said. "The Stokes investment is underperforming. Dolph told us that 2 months ago, and it's gotten worse since. He needs the water rights dispute to disappear so he can sell the consolidated land at the price he promised them. The lawsuit isn't a strategy, it's a panic." She looked at Nathan. Scared men make bad legal decisions. They overreach. Drummond's motion to dismiss hits that overreach directly. Nathan nodded. "Hire him," he said. She hired Drummond on Friday. The motion to dismiss was filed on the 4th of October, 41 days after the lawsuit landed at the Colebrook Ranch. It argued in Drummond's careful and precise language that the suit failed to state a claim upon which relief could be granted, that federal complaint proceedings were legally protected activity, and that the defendants had acted within their full legal rights in seeking federal review of a documented violation. The hearing was set for November. October moved through its work. The harvest came in. Not a great harvest. The summer had been drier than ideal in the back half, but a sufficient one, the kind that doesn't inspire celebration but doesn't require despair either, which Nathan said was what most good years actually looked like if you were honest about it. The animals were healthy. The east tributary ran clear and full to all 7 properties, including Pratt's and Hollis. Pratt had quietly told Nathan at the feed store one Saturday that he was glad the fence was down and sorry he'd taken the money, which Nathan received the way he received most apologies, without ceremony, without magnifying the wrong, with a simple nod that said, "It's done and we're moving forward." Rosie turned 6 3/4, which she felt was a significant distinction from simply 6, and spent October consolidating her hold on Dusk, her herb catalog, and the kitchen garden's winter preparation, which she had claimed as her project and which was, by any honest assessment, better organized than Margaret's first attempts at it had been. The hearing was on a Tuesday. Margaret and Nathan drove to Laramie and sat in the back of the small courtroom and listened to Elias Drummond argue their motion to dismiss in front of a territorial judge named Arthur Pennock, who had been on the bench for 14 years, and who listened to legal arguments with an expression of permanent mild skepticism that was, Drummond had warned them, simply his face. Beaumont argued for Whitmore and Stokes with the smooth fluency of an expensive lawyer who knows how to make weak positions sound reasonable. He was good. Margaret gave him that. He took a frivolous suit and dressed it in enough technical language that it sounded like a legitimate grievance. Drummond responded to each point specifically, without drama, with the exact documents that refuted each claim. He was not flashy, he was accurate. In Margaret's experience, accuracy was harder to argue with than flash, because flash was a performance and accuracy was just what was true. Judge Pennock asked 4 questions. Then he ruled. The motion to dismiss was granted. The suit was found to be without legal merit. Whitmore and Stokes were ordered to pay the defendant's legal costs. It was that clean, and that quick, and that complete. Outside the courtroom, in the cold November air, Drummond shook Nathan's hand and then, with a slight adjustment that suggested he'd thought about it, shook Margaret's as well. "Well done," he said to her. "You did the arguing," she said. "You built what I had to argue with," he said. "There's a difference, but it's not the difference people usually think it is." He went back to his office above the hardware store, and Nathan and Margaret stood on the street in Laramie in November, with the legal costs recovery in a document in Margaret's bag, and the lawsuit in a courthouse file where it would sit until it was archived and forgotten, and they looked at each other. "It's done," Nathan said. "It's done," she said. He put his arm around her, which was not a gesture he made in public often, and she leaned into it briefly, and they stood there for a moment in the Laramie street with the cold coming in from the north and the town moving around them and everything they'd built sitting there between them, invisible and real. "Can we go home now?" she said. "Yes," he said. "We can go home." They picked up Rosie from June Harlow's shop, where she had spent the morning with a degree of patience that June described as remarkable, and Rosie described as not that hard because June let me look at all the fabric, and drove back to the ranch through the November light that comes down long and flat in Wyoming and turns everything it touches into something worth looking at. Rosie sat between them on the bench and ate a piece of the hard candy June had given her, and did not ask what had happened in the courtroom because she had already decided from their faces when they walked in that it had gone well. This was Rosie's way. She read things before she was told them and then confirmed rather than inquired, which saved everyone a great deal of time. The ranch came up in the afternoon light, the cabin and the barn and the paddock and dusk moving along the fence line at the sound of the wagon because he'd learned to recognize it, and the kitchen garden's winter skeleton catching the low sun, and the east field lying bare and ready for spring. Margaret looked at it. She thought about a crossroads in a storm, about 8 words on wet paper, about a stand of cottonwoods that had smelled like wet bark and cold mud and the specific clean smell of rain on open land. She thought about the particular arithmetic of that night, what had been lost set against what had been found. And she thought it was the kind of arithmetic that didn't resolve into a simple answer because what was lost was real and what was found was real, and neither one canceled the other out. What she had understood over the course of a year that had moved from that crossroads to this farm lane was something that didn't arrive as an insight, but as an accumulation, small daily things building into something she could finally see the shape of. She had believed for a long time that the story of her life was being written by other people's choices. Her first husband's absence, Walter Whitmore's 8 words, Abe Cutter's calculation at the flooded creek, and those things had happened, and they had mattered, and she was not going to pretend they hadn't broken things in her that took real time to mend. But she had also built a fire from coals before Nathan came in. She had organized his disaster of a ledger. She had ridden to Cheyenne alone in January. She had written the complaint and the addendum and argued for the unified defense when it would have been easier to let each person handle their own fear individually. She had done these things not because she was exceptional, but because she was present and paying attention and willing to do what the situation actually required instead of what she'd imagined or hoped or feared it would require. That was the thing nobody told you when you were handed a life that had gone wrong. They told you to be strong, as if strength were a static quality you either had or didn't. What they didn't tell you was that it wasn't strength at all. It was just showing up again the next day and the day after that, and doing the next necessary thing and then the thing after that, and that the accumulated weight of all those ordinary necessary things was what actually held a life together when the extraordinary had failed you. Walter Whitmore was in Cheyenne now. She'd heard from Dolph. The Stokes investment was being restructured. Eleanor Stokes was, by reliable account, no longer certain she'd made a sound choice, which was its own particular justice, slow and quiet and more complete than anything a court could have ordered. Margaret did not think about this with satisfaction. She thought about it the way you think about weather that is past, noting it, acknowledging it, letting it be what it was. Nathan stopped the wagon in the yard, and Rosie climbed down before it was fully still, which was always how Rosie arrived anywhere, and went straight to Dusk, and Dusk came to the fence rail to meet her in the way he'd developed of coming to meet her specifically. Not the generalized attention he gave to people in the yard, but a directed movement, a recognition. Nathan unhitched the horse, and Margaret carried the bag inside and put the water on and looked around the cabin, the wood stove, the 2 chairs and the table, the extra chair that had a different meaning now, the bookshelf with its 4 books, and the room off the back where Rosie's carved horse sat on the windowsill in the east light every morning. Nathan came in and hung his coat and hat. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Next spring," she said, "I want to add a room to the north side. Rosie needs more space, and the storage can move to the barn if we reorganize the back wall." "I was thinking the same thing," he said. "I know you were. I saw you measuring the north wall last month." He looked at her for a moment. "You notice everything." "I learned it from Rosie," she said. "Or maybe she learned it from me. I'm not sure which direction it goes anymore." He came to where she was standing, and the late afternoon came in through the cabin window, and the fire was going in the wood stove, and outside Rosie was talking to Dusk in her serious, matter-of-fact way, her voice carrying through the cold air without words, just the tone of it, steady and warm and entirely without fear. There are people who get lost and find themselves. There are people who lose everything and build something new from the material that's left. Neither of these is a simple story, and neither of them comes with the guarantee of a good ending, because the world is not organized around guarantees, and the frontier in particular never pretended otherwise. What Margaret Holloway had found, what she had built, with her hands and her mind and the daily accumulation of ordinary, necessary things, was not a fairy tale and not a rescue. It was something harder than both of those and more durable than either. It was a life that she had chosen, in full knowledge of what choosing it cost and what it gave back, with a man who saw things straight and a daughter who always had, in a place that asked everything of you and gave you back, if you stayed, something you couldn't have found anywhere else. The fire in the wood stove settled and caught. The horses moved in the paddock. The light came down long and clean across the Wyoming land, touching everything the same way it always did. The good ground and the hard ground and the fence lines running out to the horizon where the sky began, vast and indifferent and full of a kind of beauty that didn't care whether you were looking at it or not, but rewarded you fully, completely, when you were.